Hey everyone. Tonight we're going deep into one of history's strangest and most fascinating rabbit holes, the world of medieval royalty, and what happens when generations of nobles keep marrying within the same family. Spoiler alert, it rarely ends well. You might not survive this story genetically speaking, but it is undeniably fascinating. Before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the content here. And tell me, what city are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Leave it in the comments. I always love seeing how far this sleepy little history community reaches. Now dim the lights. Maybe switch on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's story together. Picture this: the crackle of fire in a stone hall, candlelight flickering across silver goblets, and a young noblewoman in velvet being presented to her future husband, who also happens to be her cousin, or her uncle, or her nephew. Welcome to the elite world of medieval European aristocracy, where bloodlines mattered more than biology, and love had almost nothing to do with marriage. Today, the word inbred hits hard, but in the medieval world, it was often treated as strategy. Dynasties like the Habsburgs, the Capetians, and the Trastamaras didn't intermarry for amusement. They did it to keep power, land, and legitimacy concentrated. If you married your cousin, the castles stayed in the family. If you married a foreigner, suddenly your future heir might be raised in a rival court. The logic made sense to them, even if the long-term consequences did not. And over time, that logic created genetic whirlpools that produced some of the most tragic and compelling figures in European history. Tonight, you'll meet women who were daughters of double first cousins, nieces wed to uncles, and sisters married off to first cousins once removed. These are not just absurd little genealogy puzzles. They were real women with complicated lives, fierce loyalties, and sometimes visible symptoms of what happens when royal DNA keeps circling back on itself like a game of musical chairs. We'll move through stone palaces in Spain, shadowy castles in Austria, and glittering courts in France and the Low Countries. You'll watch empires rise and fall around these women, many of whom, if we're being honest, never had much say in their own fate. Take the Habsburgs, for example, the undisputed champions of royal inbreeding. Their family tree doesn't even look like a tree. It looks more like a wreath. They built a global empire through marriage, each match tightening the circle until the dynasty nearly strangled itself. And while we'll spend time later with some of the more notorious male Habsburgs, it was often the women who carried the generational burden, both politically and genetically. These women were mothers of kings, makers of queens, and the unwilling bearers of some very unfortunate inherited traits. But it wasn't only the Habsburgs. The Capetians of France, the Trastamaras of Spain, and even the Plantagenets of England dipped into the same shallow gene pool. The goal was always the same: secure claims, avoid civil war, and protect dynastic legitimacy. Yet with that came feuds, forced marriages, and a long trail of noblewomen trying to survive in a world where family meant everything, and, at the same time, far too much. What's striking is how visible some of the side effects became: elongated jaws, fertility problems, repeated mental illness, stillbirths, and oddly shaped skulls appear over and over again in royal lineages. and yet hardly anyone seemed eager to change course. Even the Church, which technically forbade incestuous marriages beyond a certain degree, often made exceptions for royals. The Pope would issue a dispensation, basically a holy permission slip, for one more cousin marriage, as long as it supposedly kept the peace. And here's the wild part. Modern geneticists have actually studied some of these family lines and confirmed what medieval matchmakers refused to acknowledge. Inbreeding coefficients. Yes, that's a real thing, can be measured. Several royal offspring scored at levels comparable to the children of sibling unions. One of the highest ever recorded belonged to Charles II of Spain, whose story we'll save for the end. But to give you a preview, he could barely chew, could not walk without help, and likely had the cognitive development of a very young child. And yes, he had a bewildering number of relatives who were also his cousins. Of course, not every royal woman with tangled ancestry showed obvious physical decline. Some were brilliant rulers, skilled diplomats, and deeply admired queens. One of the debates among historians today is just how much inbreeding actually shaped personality or mental stability. Was Joanna of Castile truly insane? Or was she trapped in a brutal political world where her behavior was exaggerated to keep her away from power? Was her daughter's melancholy rooted in genetics, or in a life crushed between duty and authority? That question appears again and again when you start untangling these women's stories. How much was nature, and how much was nurture? Because these women were not merely passive figures. They were queens, regents, and mothers who shaped the futures of empires. Some ruled directly, others ruled through sons or husbands, and all of them carried the weight of dynastic duty in ways their male counterparts often did not. A prince could ride off to war or drink himself into an early grave, but a princess was expected to marry whoever the crown demanded and produce heirs, no matter how many miscarriages, deformities, or depressions followed. In the next sections, we'll meet specific women whose lives reveal this strange intersection of politics, genetics, and intensely personal struggle. You'll follow Isabella of Habsburg as her bloodline folds in on itself, Joanna of Castile as her sanity is questioned, and Eleanor of Portugal as she marries her own uncle to strengthen imperial power. Along the way, we'll uncover strange details you may never have heard before, like which queen's jaw had to be softened in official portraits, or which princess was technically her husband's great aunt. So settle in gently. The next few hours may leave you feeling unexpectedly grateful for your quiet, non-royal DNA. Let's begin with one of the clearest examples of what happens when a family tree folds in on itself like an elaborate disaster of dynastic origami. Isabella of Habsburg. If you've ever wondered what it looks like to be the product of multiple generations of cousin marriage, well, here she is. Isabella did not simply belong to the Habsburg dynasty. In many ways, she embodied it, wrapped in velvet, ceremony, and one very tight genetic loop. Born in 1501, Isabella was the daughter of Philip the Handsome and Joanna of Castile, also known as Joanna the Mad, whom we'll discuss more fully in the next section. For now, all you need to note is that both of Isabella's parents were grandchildren of the same royal pair, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. That means Isabella's family tree was already curling inward from the moment she first cried in Brussels. And by the time she reached marriageable age, which of course was around 13, her value had very little to do with charm or beauty. It was about blood, Habsburg blood. She was married off to Christian II of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, a man contemporaries described as mercurial, which is often a polite historical way of saying he was difficult, unstable, and probably exhausting. Their marriage, like nearly every royal marriage of the period, was political. But it also carried an edge of urgency. Christian needed allies, and the Habsburgs wanted influence in Scandinavia. Isabella became the living channel through which that influence would flow. Her body, and more specifically her womb, became state policy. And of course, things quickly became complicated. Christian was not exactly a model husband. At times he was charming, yes, and by some accounts he did genuinely care for Isabella. But he also openly kept a favorite mistress, Dyveke Sigbrittsdottir, whom he refused to cast aside even after marrying a Habsburg princess. Dyveke was not noble, not even close, and Isabella had to sit in a Danish court carrying royal children while her husband paraded his mistress through public life. That must have burned, even for a woman raised to accept marriage as a political transaction. Still, Isabella handled herself with remarkable steadiness. She gave Christian 6 children, though only 3 survived infancy, which in itself was something of a miracle, considering both the gene pool and the general state of medieval healthcare. One of her sons, John, died young. Her daughter Dorothea, however, would go on to marry yet another cousin, because naturally, the cycle continued. Over time, Isabella's influence at court grew, especially after Dyveke died suddenly. Maybe it was poison, maybe it wasn't. The rumors were thick, the evidence was not. Some whispered that Isabella or her supporters were involved, but there is no solid proof. What is certain is that a vacancy opened in the royal mistress position, and Isabella stepped more confidently into real authority. But the genetic burden of her ancestry never disappeared. Isabella herself suffered from recurring illness, and some historians now wonder whether she may have had hemophilia or a similar inherited condition. She died very young, only 24 years old. The official explanation was simply a sudden illness, that wonderfully vague medieval phrase that could mean anything from tuberculosis to stroke, to a genetic condition no one at the time had language for. One striking detail about Isabella's short life is how educated she was. She spoke at least 5 languages thanks to her Habsburg upbringing, and not in the shallow sense of memorizing a few courtly phrases. She could carry out diplomatic discussions in Latin, Castilian, Flemish, French, and German. Her letters reveal someone sharp-minded, observant, and occasionally a little sarcastic. She was not just a vessel for heirs. She clearly understood the political board around her and moved across it as far as her position allowed. This is where historians still disagree. Was Isabella a victim of her family's fixation on blood purity, or simply unlucky in an era where early death was common even among royals? Some point to her children's fragile health and her own early death as signs of inherited weakness. Others argue that dying young was normal enough in the 16th century. And that is true to a point. But the increasingly closed Habsburg marriage circle makes the debate hard to dismiss. What is not really disputed is this: Isabella's children carried an even more concentrated version of royal blood into the next generation. Her grandson, Maximilian II, would go on to marry his first cousin. And from there, the line grew even tighter, and the inherited physical traits became harder to ignore. One eerie thing about Isabella's life is how quiet it feels in retrospect. She is one of those queens who disappears unless you deliberately go looking for her. No dramatic wars attached to her name, no giant scandal, no iconic paintings everyone recognizes. And yet, her DNA echoes through European history. Her blood ran through emperors, kings, and doomed heirs. If power in that world can be measured by legacy, Isabella was more powerful than many of the men around her. She simply never received a crown grand enough to display it. You almost want to step back through time and whisper through the centuries. Maybe skip this cousin. Maybe encourage your daughter to marry someone new. Anyone new. But she could not. That was the system. That was the game. And Isabella played it about as well as anyone with her name could. From the quiet courts of Denmark to the thunderous legacy of dynastic planning, Isabella of Habsburg remains one of the clearest examples of what happened when royalty valued blood ties just a little too much. She did not live long, but what she passed on would shape Europe for generations. And not all of those results were healthy. Now that you've met Isabella of Habsburg, it's time to go even deeper into the dim and uneasy corridors of royal heredity and meet the woman who gave her life and much of her legacy, Joanna of Castile, or as history more famously remembers her, Joanna the Mad. You've probably heard that title before. Maybe it brings to mind some half-mythical image of a barefoot queen wandering dark castle halls, whispering to herself, or clinging to her dead husband's coffin in some gothic haze of grief and obsession. And yes, a few of those stories are rooted in truth, but Joanna's real story is less about madness in the simple sense, and much more about tragedy, dynastic pressure, political convenience, and of course, the concentrated bloodlines that had already begun tightening around Europe's ruling houses. Joanna was born in 1479 to Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, the famous Catholic monarchs who united the Spanish kingdoms and sponsored Christopher Columbus. They were Spain's great political power couple, and naturally they expected their children to continue that project through carefully arranged marriages. Joanna was their third child, intelligent, devout, and by many accounts reserved. She was said to have a fierce gaze when angered, and a mind sharper than many around her realized. But one thing was already true before her life had even begun to take shape. Her family tree had that familiar royal bend in it. Her parents were second cousins. By the standards of the day, that was not especially shocking, but the inward spiral was already beginning. As a young woman, Joanna was sent to Flanders to marry Philip the Handsome. Yes, that was genuinely his nickname. And yes, it tells you something about how people saw him. Philip was the son of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I and Mary of Burgundy, and the match was designed to create a powerful alliance between Spanish and Habsburg interests. But unlike many arranged royal marriages, Joanna and Philip seem to have been genuinely attracted to one another at first. Very attracted, in fact. Their chemistry was strong enough to raise eyebrows at court. For a moment, it almost sounds romantic. But this is still royal history, and royal history rarely leaves things in peace. Philip was handsome, ambitious, and very aware of both facts. Joanna, deeply attached to him, became intensely jealous as he began openly taking lovers. She reportedly screamed, threw objects, and demanded the names of his mistresses. One rumor even claimed that she attacked a lady-in-waiting with scissors over a flirtatious glance. Now, was she mentally unstable, or was she a woman being pushed to the edge in a court where her status was constantly undercut by her husband's behavior, and her own power was always conditional? That question has never really gone away. Things worsened after Queen Isabella died, and Joanna became Queen of Castile. On paper, this should have made her one of the most powerful women in Europe. In practice, it made her the target of every ambitious man around her. Philip tried to seize power for himself, arguing that Joanna was too unstable to rule. Her father Ferdinand pushed much the same narrative. Both men wanted control of Castile, and both found it useful to depict Joanna as mentally unfit. What followed was a slow and deliberate campaign to sideline her. A story that stuck because it was politically convenient, and because Joanna truly did begin to show signs of emotional collapse. Then Philip died suddenly in 1506, reportedly after drinking cold water following a vigorous game of ball, which sounds suspiciously like the kind of explanation people invent when they do not actually know what happened. Joanna's grief became overwhelming. This is where the famous coffin story enters the historical imagination. She had Philip's body embalmed, refused to bury him for years, and traveled with the casket across Castile, stopping at monasteries to demand prayers for his soul. Some accounts say she opened the coffin from time to time, just to look at him. Others claim she would not allow women near it, terrified that even in death, her husband might somehow be seduced. Yes, that does sound unhinged. But modern historians often pause here and ask the more important question: was this madness? Or was this grief turned into political ammunition? Joanna had lost her husband, been separated from her children, and was being steadily isolated by men determined to control her inheritance. Even her attendants were often under orders to keep her in check. If you lock a woman away, deny her agency, tell the world she is unstable, and make her live under constant surveillance, how much of what follows is illness, and how much is the natural consequence of trauma? And then, of course, there is the genetic dimension. Joanna's parents were related, and Philip himself was her second cousin. Their daughter Isabella, whom we just covered, was therefore born from a line already looping inward. Trace Joanna's bloodline far enough forward, and you arrive at Charles II of Spain, whose genealogy barely resembles a tree at all. It looks more like a knot. One strange historical detail that rarely gets enough attention is the medical nonsense used to explain Joanna's behavior. Some 16th century doctors claimed female madness came from uterine misalignment, as in the womb had somehow wandered upward and was disturbing the mind. One Spanish physician described Joanna as suffering from a wandering womb, which he believed caused hysteria. The proposed treatments included herbal compresses, prayer, and in at least one suggestion, an exorcism. Modern scholars have offered more grounded possibilities. Some think Joanna may have had bipolar disorder. Others suggest schizophrenia. Still others argue for post-traumatic stress brought on by betrayal, isolation, and repeated losses. During her long confinement in Tordesillas, which lasted nearly 50 years, she lost child after child, often far away from her, without ever being allowed to properly mother them or grieve them. And yet, despite all this, she technically remained Queen of Castile. Her signature still validated decrees. Her existence still mattered, even if only as a royal symbol controlled by others. The dynasty moved forward through her blood, even as her own life narrowed to a prison of piety, grief, and silence. So what do we take from Joanna's story? She was not just the mad one. She was a woman formed by strategic inbreeding, trapped between rival male ambitions, and perhaps crushed under a burden no one around her had any intention of easing. But while her life cracked, her legacy did not. Her children shaped the future of Europe, and her story remains one of the clearest and most haunting examples of what happens when too much royal blood is combined with too little mercy. Now let Joanna linger for a moment in your imagination. Alone in a fortress, her world shrinking, her love unburied, her name remembered not for what she did, but for what others found useful to say she was. And from there, we move across the Pyrenees into another corridor of dynastic pressure and recurring bloodlines. Meet Blanche of Castile. She does not usually receive the same dramatic spotlight as queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Catherine de' Medici. But that should not fool you. Blanche was central to one of Europe's most tightly woven webs of royal inheritance. Like so many women of her time, she was born into a family already beginning to curve back into itself. Blanche entered the world in 1188, daughter of King Alfonso VIII of Castile and Eleanor of England. Yes, that Eleanor, daughter of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. So Blanche stood at the crossroads of English Plantagenet ambition and Castilian royal prestige. It also meant her family tree was already beginning its slow inward turn, since Spanish and French ruling lines were not exactly shy about marrying cousins when it suited political needs. At just 12 years old, Blanche was sent to France to marry Louis, the son of King Philip II. But in one of those wonderfully strange royal twists, she was not even the first choice. The French had originally wanted her sister Urraca. Then, at the last minute, plans changed and Blanche was chosen instead. Why the switch happened is still debated. Some said Urraca seemed too Spanish for French tastes. Others suggested Blanche had the more manageable temperament, and a few less flattering theories hint that Urraca may have shown signs of instability the French did not wish to risk. Whether that is true or just dynastic gossip dressed up as strategy, we cannot know for certain. What we do know is that Blanche married Louis VIII of France in 1200 and quickly proved she was much more than decorative royalty. When Louis became king, Blanche emerged not merely as a visible queen, but as a serious political force. And when he died in 1226, leaving behind their son Louis IX, later Saint Louis, as a boy of only 12, Blanche did not hesitate. She declared herself regent and governed France with the calm authority of someone who had spent her entire life preparing for exactly such a moment. While others might have expected her to retreat into ceremony and prayer, Blanche handled treaties, suppressed rebellious nobles, and held the fragile Capetian state together. She was no passive figure sewing tapestries in the background. She was running France. But beneath her political strength, the same hereditary pattern remained. Blanche and Louis VIII were third cousins, close enough that the church required a dispensation for the marriage. Not shocking by medieval standards, but still part of a broader trend. dynasties narrowing their own options by marrying within increasingly familiar circles. Blanche bore 13 children, though only some survived into adulthood. Louis IX became king and eventually a saint, but several of his siblings died young or had chronic health troubles. That was not unheard of in the medieval world, of course, yet historians have noted that the pattern appears somewhat pronounced even for the era. Some scholars suspect that shared ancestry may have played a role, perhaps contributing to inherited frailty or immune weakness, though the evidence remains speculative. And then there is the curious rumor that Blanche was so fiercely invested in her son's purity and kingship that she tried to limit his intimacy with his wife. Some even whispered about an unnatural emotional attachment. That is probably more court gossip than fact, but it tells us something important about how Blanche was perceived: intense, commanding, and just unsettling enough to make people uneasy. Of course, successful women in medieval politics almost always attracted that kind of reaction. Because Blanche was successful, she held France together during her son's minority, and when he left on crusade years later, she again took up the regency and governed with the same firm hand. Rebellions, famine, papal politics, noble unrest. She handled all of it. Yet even so, one question still hovers over her life. Was Blanche herself touched in subtler ways by the hereditary tightening around her family? There is no obvious record of deformity or catastrophic illness, but some letters hint that she suffered from recurring migraines and spells of melancholia, that broad medieval term that might mean depression, hormonal problems, nervous strain, or perhaps something inherited and poorly understood. Her death in 1252 adds another layer of mystery. She reportedly collapsed on the way to a convent and lingered in pain for days, murmuring prayers and seeing visions of saints. Some interpreted it as holy ecstasy. Others, more soberly, suspect a stroke or some neurological event. As with so many royal women, the exact truth is hidden beneath piety, legend, and a lack of useful medical language. And yet Blanche's story is not one of decline. It is one of force. She was also one of the first French queens known to actively support universities. She funded monastic libraries and encouraged theological study at the University of Paris. So while she was managing rebellious nobles and a kingdom in constant tension, she was also quietly helping shape Europe's intellectual future. There is something vivid in that image: Blanche moving through candlelit corridors, her mind on politics, theology, and the future of her son's crown, while everyone around her underestimated her at their own risk. So while Blanche of Castile may not be the most dramatically inbred woman in this story, she represents an early and powerful example of how royal marriage patterns began to tighten, and how women burdened by bloodlines and expectation could still carve out formidable legacies. And now we move again, this time toward Portugal, where the family geometry becomes even more uncomfortable. Let's step into the warm Iberian air of the 15th century, where royal carriages creak beneath silk, gold, and the crushing weight of dynastic expectation. Here we meet Eleanor of Portugal. If the idea of an uncle becoming a husband already makes you uneasy, that is a perfectly sensible reaction. Unfortunately, in the world Eleanor inhabited, such things were treated less as scandal and more as policy. Eleanor was born in 1434 into the House of Aviz. a branch of the Portuguese royal family known for both ambition and tangled ancestry. She was one of several children born to King Edward of Portugal and Eleanor of Aragon, which immediately made her valuable on the international marriage market. She had siblings who would become kings and queens, but Eleanor's path led north into the colder world of the Holy Roman Empire. Her marriage was supposed to secure an important alliance. What no one at the wedding wanted to emphasize too loudly was how close she and her groom already were by blood. Her husband, Emperor Frederick III, was not only her cousin, but through the dense lattice of dynastic ties, he also functioned as a kind of uncle through marriage networks so complicated they almost defy ordinary explanation. But among royals, this was not some great taboo. It was practical. If the throne stayed inside the family, rival claims stayed outside it. The Pope granted a dispensation, the marriage went ahead, and another layer was added to Europe's increasingly overworked gene pool. The relationship itself was awkward from the beginning. Eleanor traveled to Italy for the ceremony, and it was delayed multiple times because Frederick, characteristically cautious and bureaucratic, hesitated to commit. He reportedly did not even properly meet her until the wedding day, at which point he is said to have remarked that she was prettier than her portrait. It is hard to tell whether that counts as romance or simply relief. The wedding finally took place in 1452, and Eleanor became Holy Roman Empress, one of the most prestigious titles in Christendom. But prestige does not guarantee warmth. Eleanor had been raised in the more vibrant and artistically rich courts of Portugal. Frederick's court, by contrast, was cold, rigid, and relentlessly frugal. He cared about administration, accounts, and control. She wanted music, beauty, and life. One letter from the period suggests she once complained that her husband would rather count coins than kiss his wife. That tells you plenty. Still, they fulfilled their dynastic purpose. They had 5 children, 3 of whom survived infancy. One of them was Maximilian I, who would go on to become Holy Roman Emperor and, naturally, marry another cousin, further tightening the Habsburg rise to power. But Eleanor struggled. Her health began to fail, likely from repeated pregnancies, harsh winters, emotional strain, and the numbing loneliness of life in a court that never really became home. And then there is the hereditary backdrop again. Both Eleanor and Frederick already shared ancestors through interwoven Iberian and Burgundian lines. Their marriage concentrated those bloodlines even further. Their son Maximilian displayed early signs of the famed Habsburg jaw, which would later become one of the dynasty's most visible symbols. But the jaw was only the external marker. More troubling were the patterns historians detect beneath it: miscarriages, recurring melancholia, possible immune disorders, and the faint but persistent signs of hereditary weakness that kept surfacing across the family. One of the hauntingly human details about Eleanor is that some of her letters survive. In them, she writes to her brother King Afonso V of Portugal about the isolation of imperial court life, her homesickness, and how alien she felt in the halls she was meant to inhabit as empress. There is something startlingly modern in those complaints. She sounds less like a distant legend and more like a woman stranded far from home, trying to stay composed inside a marriage that had become duty more than companionship. Historians still debate whether Eleanor was simply mismatched with her husband and trapped by politics, or whether some of her decline also reflected the genetic burden carried by noble families of the era. Her symptoms have been attributed to tuberculosis, depression, and even porphyria, a blood disorder sometimes linked to aristocratic lineages, and occasionally mistaken for hysteria or madness. The evidence is inconclusive, but the pattern of frailty is difficult to ignore. She died young, just 32 years old. Officially, it was illness. In practice, it was probably the familiar blend of overstrain, neglect, and whatever hidden vulnerabilities her bloodline had already begun to pass along. Frederick, in one of the colder details of this whole story, did not even attend her funeral. He reportedly remained occupied with administrative affairs. And yet, Eleanor's legacy stretched far beyond her short life. Through Maximilian, her blood moved into the central Habsburg line and helped shape the future of Europe for generations. Her descendants would rule kingdoms and empires, carrying both the strength and the weakness of the heritage she passed on. What stands out most in Eleanor's story is not madness or dramatic rebellion. It is sadness. She was not remembered as unhinged like Joanna, nor as politically iron-willed like Blanche. She seems instead soft-edged, sensitive, and too human for the machine she was placed inside. But she still did what was asked of her. She produced the next dynasty. And for a royal woman of her era, that was considered both success and sacrifice in their most unforgiving form. Next, we come to Margaret of Austria, Eleanor of Portugal's granddaughter, and one of the sharpest political minds to emerge from this increasingly compact royal world. By the time Margaret entered the story, the Habsburg line had already twisted itself into such elaborate knots that nearly every major court in Europe seemed connected by blood, marriage, or both. Margaret was born in 1480 in Brussels, the daughter of Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, and Mary of Burgundy. That already placed her at the center of one of Europe's most powerful dynastic crossroads. And like so many children of this world, she was hardly treated as a child for long. She was viewed as an asset, a future treaty, a living bargaining piece draped in silk. Her mother died when Margaret was very young after a riding accident, leaving her motherless at the age of 2. Grief, however, had little room to breathe in royal politics. Almost immediately, Margaret was transformed into a diplomatic instrument. Her father arranged her betrothal to the French Dauphin Charles, the boy who would later become King Charles VIII of France. At only 3 years old, Margaret was sent to the French court to be raised as its future queen. It was a classic Habsburg strategy: secure alliances early, plant the bride in place, and hope the next phase of politics cooperated. But politics rarely stays loyal to children. When Charles reached marriageable age, he broke the arrangement and chose Anne of Brittany instead, gaining a major territorial advantage and leaving Margaret politically humiliated. She had spent years being educated for a crown she would never wear, only to be quietly sent back. That could easily have broken her. Instead, it hardened her. Margaret was married again, this time to John, Prince of Asturias, heir to the Spanish throne. Once more, the bloodlines looped inward. Margaret and John were related through the same dense web of Habsburg and Trastamara connections that bound most of Europe's ruling families together. Their marriage did not last. John died within a year, probably of illness, though rumors of poison circulated, because royal courts never seem able to resist a dramatic explanation. Still not yet 20, Margaret was already twice used by dynastic strategy and twice widowed or discarded by it. But unlike many royal women who vanished into devotional obscurity after such losses, Margaret refused to fade. She returned to Habsburg lands and gradually built a power base of her own. She never remarried. Instead, she dedicated herself to government, diplomacy, and culture, eventually serving twice as governor of the Netherlands. And she was excellent at it. This is what makes Margaret so striking. She did not merely survive the system, she learned how to master it. She oversaw one of Europe's richest and most strategically vital regions while navigating relations with France, Spain, and England. Kings consulted her, ambassadors reported to her. She became one of those rare women in dynastic history whose influence was impossible to hide, even in a world determined to credit men first. Of course, the genetic context was still there. Margaret's father had married within the same aristocratic circle. Her brother Philip the Handsome would marry Joanna of Castile, who was also kin through the wider dynastic web. Margaret herself had already married within that network. The Habsburg family tree by this point had started to resemble less a branching structure and more a looped strip folding back over itself. And yet, Margaret personally seems to have escaped the worst visible effects of this hereditary concentration. She was intelligent, active, and by most accounts, physically capable for much of her life. Some historians point to her as one of the rare Habsburg women who seemed to sidestep the family's decline. But even if she did not suffer its worst symptoms herself, she certainly saw them gathering around her. As guardian to younger relatives, including her nephew Charles V and his siblings, she witnessed firsthand the ways Habsburg bloodlines were becoming more fragile and more enclosed. One niece, Eleanor of Austria, would marry another cousin. Another, Catherine, would marry John III of Portugal, her double first cousin. Margaret arranged some of these marriages herself, not because she was blind to the pattern, but because the system allowed very little else. She was playing within the constraints available to her. There is a quietly tragic irony in that. She was one of the clearest minds in the dynasty, fully capable of understanding both politics and consequence, yet still bound to reproduce the same cycle through the marriages she negotiated. Margaret also had a surprisingly vivid personal side. She kept a pet monkey named Babar, loved books and art, and was known for her wit. Her correspondence with the humanist Erasmus reveals a woman of intelligence, dry humor, and sharp judgment. In one letter, she described a courtier as having the charm of a leaky wine barrel, which is wonderfully cruel and precise. Historians still debate the exact extent of her power. Some see her as a skillful but ultimately obedient extension of male Habsburg strategy. Others argue she was the real political operator, moving pieces behind the curtain while emperors and kings took the credit in public. The truth is probably somewhere in between. What is certain is that her administration kept the Netherlands relatively stable during turbulent years, and that is no small achievement. Margaret died in 1530 at the age of 50, after complications from stepping on a nail, which is a strangely mundane end for someone who had survived so much dynastic chaos. Her death was deeply mourned. Erasmus himself wrote of the loss not simply as the passing of a noblewoman, but of one of Europe's finest minds. In many ways, Margaret stands in contrast to the more tragic queens and princesses around her. She was born inside the same hereditary maze, but she managed to make that maze work for her more effectively than most.
She still arranged the cousin marriages that would tighten her family's genetic fabric even further, yes, but she did so not out of ignorance or cruelty.
She was working within a game she had not invented and could not truly escape. Now we move into England, where another princess shaped by these same dynastic patterns would find herself at the center of one of history's most famous marital disasters, Catherine of Aragon. You probably know her first as Henry VIII's first wife, the queen he cast aside in pursuit of Anne Boleyn, setting off a religious and political earthquake in England. But before she ever became a symbol of marital betrayal and royal stubbornness, Catherine was already the product of generations of dynastic calculation. She was born in 1485, the youngest daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the same formidable pair who had already appeared in Joanna's story. Catherine arrived during one of Spain's great moments of triumph, just as the Reconquista was reaching its conclusion and the Catholic monarchs were consolidating their power. She was, in every sense, dynastic gold, educated, pious, multilingual, and perfectly positioned for a major political marriage. And her lineage was already tightly drawn. Her parents were second cousins, part of the Trastamara dynasty that had intermarried across Iberia and beyond for generations. Through both sides, Catherine carried Habsburg and Plantagenet blood, as well as the familiar concentration of elite European ancestry that made royal marriage options feel both prestigious and alarmingly repetitive. At just 3 years old, Catherine was promised to Arthur, Prince of Wales, son of Henry VII of England. By 15, she was sent to the English court with her dowry, her ladies, and the full weight of Spanish political expectations. Her marriage to Arthur in 1501 was meant to cement a major alliance between Spain and England, two powers with every reason to cooperate. But the plan unraveled almost immediately. Only a few months after the wedding, Arthur died, likely from illness. Suddenly, Catherine was left in an awkward, vulnerable position. She was a widow in a foreign country, her dowry not fully settled, and her future hanging on one deeply sensitive question. Had her marriage to Arthur been consummated? That issue, humiliating as it was, would later become one of the most explosive theological and political questions in Europe. But at the time, it was simply the hinge on which Catherine's future swung. The answer put forward was no. Catherine insisted that the marriage had not been consummated, which meant she could marry Arthur's younger brother Henry without directly violating church law. A papal dispensation was secured, and the path was cleared for her eventual marriage to the future Henry VIII. That wedding took place in 1509, after Henry VII died, and the young, dazzling Henry VIII came to the throne. For a while, things actually seemed promising. Catherine was queen, admired by the English people, respected for her intelligence, and more politically capable than many around her. When Henry campaigned in France, Catherine even served as regent and oversaw affairs during the English victory at Flodden against Scotland. But beneath the polished image, tragedy accumulated. Catherine was pregnant many times, at least 6 by most counts. Yet only one child, Mary, survived into adulthood. The rest were stillborn, miscarried, or died shortly after birth. The pressure on Catherine was immense. England needed a male heir, and every failed pregnancy narrowed her place at court. Henry, once devoted to her, became restless, bitter, and increasingly convinced that something was wrong at the heart of their marriage. Was the union cursed? Was God punishing them for the fact that Catherine had first been married to Henry's brother? These were the ideas whispered at court. Modern scholarship has added another possible explanation. Some researchers have suggested that the repeated infant losses may have had a biological basis, potentially involving Kell blood group incompatibility or another reproductive issue. If so, Catherine's tragic pregnancies may have reflected not merely bad luck, but the hidden consequences of long dynastic intermarriage and genetic incompatibility. Whatever the cause, Catherine paid the price. By the mid-1520s, Henry had fixed his attention on Anne Boleyn and become determined to set Catherine aside. She was stripped of status, isolated, and pressured into accepting an annulment she believed to be morally false. But Catherine refused. To the end, she insisted that she was Henry's lawful wife and England's true queen. And that refusal helped change history. Henry broke with Rome. The monasteries were dissolved. England began its long and violent religious transformation. The marriage of one royal woman, already shaped by dynastic necessity and years of reproductive suffering, became the spark for a national rupture. Catherine remained dignified through all of it. She was scholarly, deeply religious, and intellectually serious. Erasmus praised her learning. In later life, as she was confined and increasingly marginalized, she spent much of her time in prayer, embroidery, and correspondence. Her final letter to Henry still addressed him tenderly, which reads either as remarkable grace or the last expression of a lifetime spent trying to preserve meaning inside an arrangement built on power. Historians continue to debate whether Catherine's reproductive losses were simply a sad feature of the era or signs of deeper hereditary fragility. But whatever the medical truth, her life makes one thing painfully clear. Royal blood purity could not protect a woman from being used, blamed, and ultimately discarded. Now we turn to another woman who carried that same burden into the heart of the Habsburg world more directly. Isabella of Portugal. If Catherine of Aragon embodied endurance under humiliation, Isabella of Portugal represents the crushing weight of dynastic perfection. She did not just marry a cousin, she married her double first cousin, one of the most genetically risky and politically celebrated unions of the age. Isabella was the daughter of Manuel I of Portugal and Maria of Aragon, who was Catherine of Aragon's sister. That meant Isabella stood at the intersection of the Portuguese Aviz line and the Spanish Trastamara line, two houses already deeply tangled through repeated intermarriage. When she married Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, the circle closed even tighter. Charles was not simply her cousin through one branch. He was her cousin through both sides. Their marriage in 1526 was celebrated as a triumph. Charles was the most powerful ruler in Europe, master of Spain, parts of Italy, the Low Countries, the Holy Roman Empire, and territories across the Atlantic. Isabella, meanwhile, was considered the ideal match, the purest royal blood available. The wedding was lavish, full of music, ceremony, poetry, and political satisfaction. Historians have often noted that Charles seems to have genuinely loved Isabella, something unusual enough in royal marriages to deserve mention. By the standards of kings, he was unusually faithful. He missed her when away, valued her judgment, and treated her as more than a symbolic consort. But affection did not cancel biology. Isabella and Charles had 7 children, though only 3 survived to adulthood. Among them was Philip II of Spain, the future ruler whose own marriages would continue the same suffocating pattern of dynastic repetition. Isabella herself was highly educated, deeply pious, and politically capable. While Charles spent long periods away governing or waging war, she acted as regent in Spain and managed taxation, trade, provisioning, and administration with striking skill. Their surviving letters show an impressive working partnership as well as personal affection. Isabella wrote not only about family matters, but also about unrest, money, supplies, and imperial developments, with the clarity of someone who understood statecraft in detail. Yet behind all that composure were the familiar signs of strain. She endured repeated pregnancies, several of which ended badly. She suffered anxiety, poor health, and what many historians believe may have been chronic depression, whether postpartum or otherwise. Medieval and early modern sources often blur such suffering under vague terms like melancholia. But the pattern is familiar enough by now. Repeated reproductive trauma, emotional burden, and a body under relentless dynastic demand. One especially haunting incident was recorded during her final pregnancy. Isabella fainted publicly during a religious procession, collapsing on cathedral steps before a stunned crowd. She never fully recovered. She died in 1539 at just 36, officially from complications of childbirth. As always, that phrase hides a world of possibilities: infection, hemorrhage, bodily collapse after too many pregnancies, or all of them together. Charles was devastated. He wore black for the rest of his life, commissioned memorials in her honor, and never remarried. For a ruler of his stature, that decision says a great deal. But Isabella's death did not end her dynastic role. Through Philip II, her blood moved forward into an even tighter Habsburg future. Philip would later marry his niece and his cousins, deepening the hereditary damage. Historians sometimes describe Isabella and Charles's marriage as the moment the Habsburg project shifted from calculated strategy to near surrender, from carefully managed alliance building to self-consuming genetic closure. The signs were there, though no one yet had the language to name them. Isabella's letters speak of illness, headaches, stillbirths, and duty, but never of heredity, of course. That concept would come much later. She could not know that the line she helped preserve would eventually produce one of Europe's most tragic royal collapses. Her story is often overshadowed by louder figures, but it deserves attention. She was exactly what a queen of her age was expected to be: noble, capable, obedient, fertile, intelligent, and uncomplaining. And like so many such women, she died too soon. Now the story shifts north again, away from the sunlit courts of Iberia and into the colder, richer, more politically volatile world of Burgundy and the Low Countries, where silk, trade, ambition, and hereditary strategy were braided together just as tightly as anywhere else in Europe. Here we meet Marie of Burgundy. If you were hoping for a pause in the long parade of tangled dynasties, Marie is not that pause. She is another woman caught in the expanding Habsburg web, though unlike some of the others, she briefly seemed to have a real chance to shape her own fate. She was not simply born into a dynastic maze. She stood at the center of one. Marie was born in 1457, the only child of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and Isabella of Bourbon. Her ancestry was already rich with the usual noble overlap. Her mother came from the Bourbon and Valois lines, and like so many elite family trees of the era, Marie's had already begun folding inward through repeated aristocratic intermarriage. It was not yet at full Habsburg intensity, but the pattern was very much in place. Her father, like most noblemen of his rank, had wanted a son. But when Marie became his only heir, he did not raise her as merely decorative nobility. She was educated to rule. She learned court ceremony, political expectation, and the language of sovereignty, because Burgundy was too wealthy and too strategically important to be left unguarded. Then everything changed in 1477, when Charles the Bold was killed in battle at Nancy. Marie was only 19. Suddenly, she was not just a duchess in waiting or a dynastic daughter. She became ruler of one of the richest territories in Europe, unmarried, exposed, and intensely desirable as a political prize. France circled immediately. Louis XI wanted Burgundy brought under French control, ideally through marriage. The local Burgundian elites, however, were wary of France and leaned toward another option, the Habsburgs. So the nobles proposed a match with Maximilian of Austria, son of Frederick III and Eleanor of Portugal. Yes, that Maximilian, the same one who would help create the massive Habsburg inheritance that later generations would spend centuries trying to preserve through increasingly uncomfortable marriages. Marie, to her credit, was not simply swept away by this plan without resistance. She delayed negotiations, pressed for favorable terms, and secured support from her provinces by issuing the Great Privilege, a major concession that restored local rights and limited central authority. That was not the move of a passive girl being traded away. It was the move of someone politically alert and aware that marriage would shape the fate of her lands. Still, dynastic momentum is difficult to stop. Marie married Maximilian in 1477, and with that marriage, Burgundy's enormous inheritance passed into Habsburg hands. It was one of the great turning points in European politics. The Low Countries, the Burgundian legacy, and the Habsburg future all fused together in a way that would reshape the continent for generations. And here again we encounter the quiet, ominous note beneath the grandeur. Marie and Maximilian were not immediate close relatives in the dramatic way of uncle-niece unions, but they were still tied through the familiar network of noble blood. Their children carried a mix of Burgundian, French, Austrian, and already partially recycled aristocratic ancestry. Their son, Philip the Handsome, would later marry Joanna of Castile, and from that union came Charles V. So Marie, in a very real sense, stood near the root of the great Habsburg consolidation. She did not live long enough to witness what it would become. In 1482, only 5 years after her wedding, Marie died from injuries sustained in a riding accident. Her horse slipped, she was crushed, and she lingered in agony for days before dying at the age of 25. It is one of those cruelly mundane medieval endings that feels almost unfair in its simplicity.
a woman surrounded by extraordinary power, reduced by one fall. Her death left a political vacuum, of course. Maximilian mourned, the court reeled, and the inheritance she had brought into the marriage remained in Habsburg hands. In a long arc of dynastic history, Marie mattered enormously. Without her, the Habsburg-Burgundian fusion might never have happened. Without that fusion, the later imperial map of Europe would look very different. There is a fascinating physical afterlife to her story as well. During modern restoration work, her tomb in Bruges was opened, and researchers found her skeleton remarkably well preserved, including evidence of the spinal damage consistent with the chronicler's description of her fatal accident. It is one of those unsettling moments where legend, record, and bone all line up. Historians continue to debate whether Marie should be remembered mainly as a hinge of empire or as a lost ruler whose own political potential was cut short. Both readings have merit. She was the mechanism through which the Habsburgs gained Burgundy, but she was also an educated, active young sovereign who might have ruled independently had events unfolded differently. Instead, her body, title, and inheritance became part of a dynasty that would later fold inwards so tightly it nearly destroyed itself. From Marie, we move deeper into Spain, where the hereditary tightening becomes less subtle and more alarming. Now we meet Anna of Austria.
She was serene, dutiful, and almost perfectly suited to what the Spanish court demanded in a queen. Pious, obedient, fertile, and politically unthreatening. But behind that calm public image lies one of the most disturbing marriage arrangements in the Habsburg story. Because Anna did not simply marry a cousin, she married her uncle, her actual biological uncle. Anna was born in 1549, the daughter of Maximilian II, Holy Roman Emperor, and Maria of Spain. Maria, in turn, was the sister of Philip II of Spain. So when Philip married Anna in 1570, he married his own sister's daughter. Even for a dynasty already deeply committed to keeping things in the family, that is hard to look at without wincing. Philip had already been married 3 times before Anna. First to Maria Manuela of Portugal, his double first cousin. Then to Mary I of England, who was also kin through the broader royal web. Then to Elizabeth of Valois, another dynastic match. By the time Anna entered the picture, the Habsburg strategy had become almost aggressively inward-looking. The question was no longer whether to marry a relative. The question was which relative best preserved political control and bloodline purity. A papal dispensation was required, of course, and Rome approved it, because politics routinely outranked discomfort when crowns were involved. Anna was just 17. Philip was 43. By the standards of the century, the age gap itself was not especially shocking. The degree of consanguinity, however, was extreme even by royal norms. And strangely enough, the marriage seems to have been fairly calm. Anna was kind, devout, and reportedly affectionate toward Philip. He, in his own cold and highly controlled way, seems to have valued her. Their relationship lacked the public ugliness that defined so many royal marriages. No famous scandal, no dramatic emotional warfare. She played her role cleanly and effectively. Most importantly for the dynasty, she gave birth to 5 children in quick succession.
4 survived infancy, which was itself something of a Habsburg miracle. One of them was Philip III of Spain, who would inherit both the throne and the slowly mounting hereditary burden. Because while Anna herself appeared outwardly stable and healthy enough, the deeper cost of these repeated close unions was accumulating in the next generation. Philip III did not carry the most extreme physical deformities of the line, but he was widely regarded as passive, dependent, and emotionally weak. He leaned heavily on favorites, especially the Duke of Lerma, and scholars often point to his reign as one of the quieter phases of Spanish decline. Not total collapse, not yet, but an unmistakable slackening of vitality. This is where heredity becomes eerie rather than dramatic. The effects are not always explosive. Sometimes they look like softness where there should be discipline, indecision where there should be command, fragility where there should be endurance. Medical historians have also linked the Habsburg line's repeated uncle-niece and cousin marriages to the worsening of mandibular prognathism, the famous Habsburg jaw. Anna's children showed early signs of it, though it would reach its most catastrophic expression later in Charles II. Anna died in 1580, just before her 31st birthday, after yet another childbirth. It was the kind of end that had become chillingly ordinary in royal history. A body used repeatedly for heirs, then quietly broken by the process. Philip was deeply affected by her death. He shut himself away for a time, wore mourning for the rest of his life, and never remarried. Some accounts say he kept her portrait near him constantly. One of the stranger, more intimate details about Anna is her fascination with relics. She collected saints' bones, fragments of robes, and pieces of what was claimed to be the true cross.
Her private devotional world was crowded with sacred objects, almost to the point of excess. Maybe that reflected sincere piety. Maybe it was a coping mechanism in a life built on obedience and erasure of self. Historians still ask whether Anna fully grasped the genetic implications of marrying Philip. It is hard to believe she did not understand the closeness of the kinship. But in her world, that closeness was not considered grotesque. It was considered practical. And through her children, especially Philip III, she helped carry the Habsburg line another step closer to its final disaster. Now we meet a woman who, unlike Anna, actually ruled with real authority. Juana of Austria, sometimes called Joanna or Juana, depending on the source, was Anna's sister-in-law, and one of the more remarkable women in the dynasty. She was not merely shuffled from marriage to motherhood and then erased. She governed. Juana was born in 1535, the daughter of Charles V and Isabella of Portugal. Yes, those double first cousins from the earlier section. So from birth, her pedigree was exceptionally concentrated. She was Habsburg through and through, the product of one of the most tightly controlled dynastic unions of the age. And yet she seems, at least physically and intellectually, to have escaped the worst visible consequences. She was educated, composed, and highly capable. She spoke multiple languages, understood theology and statecraft, and moved through court life with the confidence of someone raised not only among rulers, but as part of the machinery of rule itself. At just 17, she was married to Prince João Manuel of Portugal, her first cousin. Once again, the lines doubled back. The Portuguese and Spanish royal houses had been exchanging genes, titles, and ambitions for generations. João Manuel himself was not particularly robust.
He died less than 2 years into the marriage, likely of illness, leaving Juana widowed at 19 and pregnant.
Her son, Sebastian of Portugal, was born shortly after his father's death. He would later become king and eventually drive Portugal into disaster through his crusading obsession and fatal Moroccan campaign. But that comes later. The immediate effect on Juana's life was profound. The Portuguese expected her to remain. She refused. She returned to Spain and, in one of the most extraordinary developments in this whole chain of stories, was appointed regent of Spain by her brother Philip II while he was away. That matters. She was not just a ceremonial placeholder. She governed. She handled finances, diplomacy, military matters, and the daily burdens of rule with serious competence. In a world that treated female authority with suspicion, Juana proved herself entirely capable of managing one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. That makes her unusual in this gallery of royal women. She was not only an instrument of dynasty, she briefly became one of its operators. Later, she withdrew into religious life and founded the convent of Las Descalzas Reales in Madrid. But this was not exactly a simple retreat into holy silence. The convent became its own kind of power center, filled with art, relics, political significance, and Juana's own commanding presence. She never remarried. Historians debate whether this was pure piety or a strategic refusal to be recycled into another marriage alliance. It could easily have been both. Her relationship with her son Sebastian remains one of the more painful elements of her story. She left Portugal and never truly returned to raise him. He grew up under heavy clerical influence, became intensely religious and rigid, and eventually died in battle without heirs, helping trigger the succession crisis that allowed Spain to absorb Portugal. Juana, for all her brilliance, could not stop that outcome. There is a striking little anecdote about her reputation at court. She was said never to raise her voice in councils full of men competing, arguing, and performing authority. Juana supposedly had the ability to quiet a room with barely more than a glance. Whether the story is fully true or polished by admiration, it fits the image history leaves of her: contained, intelligent, formidable. Some historians call her the last clean Habsburg, in the sense that she appears to have escaped the worst physical and mental signs of the dynasty's decline. Others think she was simply a statistical exception, an unusually successful outcome in a line that was otherwise narrowing toward breakdown. Either way, she was one of the most capable women in the family, and even she could not change what was coming. From Juana, we move into the Spanish Netherlands, where another Habsburg woman managed to rule with unusual steadiness, despite carrying one of the dynasty's most concentrated bloodlines. This is Isabella Clara Eugenia. She was the daughter of Philip II and Anna of Austria, which means she was the product of that uncle-niece marriage we just discussed. Genetically speaking, her existence was already the result of a dangerously compressed family tree. And yet, Isabella turned out to be healthy enough, intelligent enough, and politically competent enough to become one of the last truly functional rulers of the line. Born in 1566, she was raised at the Spanish court with a serious education.
Latin, French, Italian, theology, rhetoric, diplomacy. She was trained not merely to ornament a throne, but to understand one. That is important because Isabella was not raised as an afterthought. Philip II seems to have seen in her a daughter of unusual value. For a time, marriage negotiations swirled around her, as they always did. Possible husbands included various cousins and foreign rulers. Yet Philip delayed and hesitated. There are strong hints that he simply could not bear to send her away too easily. She remained unmarried far longer than most royal women, which in itself is remarkable. Eventually, however, politics intervened. The Spanish Netherlands needed stabilizing, and Philip found a solution that was both strategic and familiar. Isabella would marry Archduke Albert of Austria, her cousin, and the two would jointly rule the Netherlands. That happened in 1598, and unlike many arranged dynastic marriages, theirs appears to have worked surprisingly well. It was not some great love story, but it was functional, respectful, and effective. Together, they governed a region battered by war, religious division, and rebellion. Isabella was not a passive consort there. She ruled. She negotiated. She handled nobles, worked with ministers, and helped hold together a territory that might easily have fractured further. Contemporary accounts portray her as disciplined, pragmatic, and deeply engaged in administration. She rose early, worked long hours, and treated government as labor, not just ceremony. One small detail captures her well. A priest once reportedly tried to interrupt her administrative work to remind her about prayer, and Isabella is said to have replied, in effect, that the flock still needed feeding. It is a perfect Habsburg line, pious and practical at once. She and Albert had no surviving children. Whether that reflected infertility, miscarriage, or simple bad luck remains unclear. Given the dynasty's hereditary history, speculation has never stopped. But notably, neither seems to have been publicly destroyed by the absence of an heir in the same way so many other royal marriages were. Their partnership retained its balance. After Albert's death in 1621, Isabella took religious vows, but like several powerful royal widows before her, she did not vanish into devotional irrelevance. She continued to wield political influence and remained central to governance in the Netherlands. In effect, she became a nun without surrendering power. She also had a love of theater and performance. She reviewed plays, enjoyed staging, and reportedly took part in dramatic productions earlier in life. It is one of those details that makes her feel unexpectedly vivid. Not just a ruler in black velvet, but a cultivated woman with artistic taste and discipline. Historians often ask whether Isabella Clara Eugenia was the last truly competent Habsburg. Some say yes. They see her as the final bright figure before the dynasty sank further into physical and psychological deterioration. Others argue that she benefited from circumstance, a smaller political arena, a supportive husband, a role that suited her talents. Both views may be true. What matters is that she ruled well. She died in 1633 at the age of 66, an impressively long life for a Habsburg woman. Her funeral was widely attended, and her political legacy remained strong. For once, a Habsburg woman was remembered not mainly for childbirth, fragility, or scandal, but for leadership. that alone makes her stand apart. And from here, the story prepares to move toward France, Versailles, and yet another branch of the royal web, where Habsburg blood and Bourbon ambition begin mixing in ways that will eventually feed into the age of Louis XIV and, much later, the world that produces Marie Antoinette. Now the scene shifts to Versailles, where the air smells of perfume, polished wood, satin, and performance. Mirrors multiply candlelight, courtiers whisper behind fans, and appearances matter almost as much as blood. Here we meet Maria Theresa of Spain. At first glance, she seems far removed from the darker Gothic corridors of earlier Habsburg history. But she is not outside the dynastic pattern. She is one of its clearest late expressions. A woman born from generations of repeated royal intermarriage, wrapped in ceremony, and sent across borders to serve as a living treaty. Maria Theresa was born in 1638, the daughter of Philip IV of Spain and Elizabeth of France.
Her lineage was already alarmingly tight. Her parents were first cousins. Her grandparents had also married within overlapping dynastic circles. By the time Maria Theresa arrived, the Spanish Habsburg line was no longer merely protective of blood purity. It was recycling itself with extraordinary determination. She was raised in the somber Spanish court, surrounded by rigid Catholic ritual, black formal clothing, and a culture that prized obedience and solemnity. Her education was respectable, but limited in the familiar royal feminine way. Religion, decorum, piety, music, grace. She was being prepared not to rule, but to marry well and preserve dynastic dignity. That opportunity came when peace negotiations between France and Spain required a major symbolic union. Maria Theresa was chosen to marry Louis XIV of France, the future Sun King. And here the family web tightened yet again. Louis was not some unrelated foreign prince. He was her double first cousin. So when Maria Theresa crossed into France in 1660, she was not bringing fresh blood into the royal system. She was carrying the same old dynastic threads into another court, only now dressed in French silk instead of Spanish black. The wedding was one of the great political spectacles of the century. France gained prestige, Spain gained a temporary peace, and Maria Theresa became queen of the most theatrical court in Europe. From the beginning, though, the marriage was unbalanced. Maria Theresa was gentle, devout, sheltered, and emotionally reserved. Louis XIV was dazzling, ambitious, self-conscious, worldly, and thoroughly committed to making himself the center of political and cultural gravity. She came from a court of restraint. He was building one of display. She entered Versailles carrying Spanish sobriety into an environment that rewarded charm, agility, seduction, and polished survival. She tried to adapt. She smiled when expected, fulfilled her ceremonial duties, and gave birth to 6 children, but only one survived into adulthood. The others died in infancy or early childhood, continuing the familiar royal pattern of loss that followed these lineages with almost ritual regularity. Maria Theresa herself was never physically imposing. Portraits and descriptions suggest a small woman, often unwell, prone to migraines, nervous exhaustion, headaches, and long spells of silence or withdrawal. Some modern historians suspect chronic illness,
aggravated by stress and hereditary fragility. Whatever the precise diagnosis might have been, she does not seem to have moved easily through the glittering cruelty of Versailles. And Versailles could be cruel. Louis quickly returned to what he always loved most: power, performance, and mistresses. His affairs were not discreet little private embarrassments. They became part of the court's rhythm. Maria Theresa had to live in a palace where her husband's infidelities were practically staged as public decoration. She endured it with quiet patience, but that endurance came at a cost. One striking personal detail about her is her love of chocolate. She had brought the Spanish habit north, and she reportedly drank thick, hot chocolate flavored with cinnamon and vanilla almost every morning. Some contemporaries even blamed her headaches on it. Whether or not that was true, the image lingers. A queen in a cold foreign court, wrapped in velvet, drinking chocolate, while whispers about the king's latest favorite drifted through the halls. Historians still debate whether Maria Theresa was simply too soft for Versailles, or whether she was already a woman physically and emotionally worn down by the larger dynastic burden she carried. But either way, her life demonstrates something important. A royal woman could be Queen of France and still remain, in some essential way, a stranger in her own marriage and court. She died in 1683. Louis reportedly remarked, with breathtaking coldness, that this was the first time she had caused him pain. It is one of those lines that history remembers, because it manages to be both polished and brutal at once. Still, her legacy endured. Through her surviving son, the Bourbon line continued, and through later dynastic developments, the bloodlines of Bourbon and Habsburg Europe looped together again. From Maria Theresa, we step slightly backward in time, but deeper into the same pattern. Now we meet Elizabeth of Valois. At first, she can seem like a kind of soft interruption in the Habsburg pattern. Young, graceful, French, culturally vivid. But her story is no less rooted in the same machinery of dynastic strategy. She was another royal daughter used to seal peace, another carefully placed body in a crumbling political order, another woman whose life narrowed around fertility, duty, and inherited pressure. Elizabeth was born in 1545, the eldest daughter of Henry II of France and Catherine de' Medici. She was intelligent, elegantly educated, and raised in a court far more energetic and expressive than the Spanish one she would later enter. France gave her music, language, social fluency, and the softer polish of Renaissance court culture. But none of that was enough to protect her from the logic of treaty marriage. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, which ended prolonged conflict between France and Spain, required a major marital alliance. So Elizabeth, only 13 at the time of the agreement, was promised to Philip II of Spain. This is one of those royal moments where a teenager is treated less as a person than as a diplomatic ribbon tied around a war settlement. And again, there was a family connection. She was not as closely related to Philip as Anna of Austria later would be, but the wider European dynastic network was already full of repeated interlinking between Valois, Habsburg, and other noble lines. Nothing about the marriage represented a real break from aristocratic hereditary closure. Elizabeth married Philip in 1559. She was 14.
He was already an experienced ruler, much older, intensely reserved, and shaped by the cold discipline of the Habsburg court. The contrast between them was striking. She came from a lively French environment, He lived in a world of dark fabrics, rigid ceremony, control, and devotional austerity. Spain did not make itself easy for her. The court was formal to the point of suffocation. Silence, protocol, long masses, public restraint, all of it pressed in. Yet Elizabeth seems to have adapted better than might be expected. Philip, in his distant way, appears to have grown sincerely attached to her. Their relationship, while never exactly warm in a modern sense, developed into something like mutual respect and quiet affection. But again, the central burden was reproduction. Elizabeth was expected to provide a male heir, and this expectation followed the familiar tragic script. She had daughters, miscarriages, and repeated difficult pregnancies. In 1568, still only 23 years old, she died, likely from complications related to childbirth, possibly a ruptured uterus. It is another one of those brutal royal endings that history almost learns to speak of too calmly. Young bride, several pregnancies, flicker of political usefulness, death. One small but vivid detail about Elizabeth is her love of books. She kept a personal library and insisted on maintaining texts in both French and Spanish. A court lady once remarked that the queen spent more time with pages than pearls. It was probably meant as a slight. Now it reads like a compliment. She also deserves attention because she was not politically empty. Though she did not wield formal authority in the way Isabella, Clara, Eugenia, or Juana of Austria did, Elizabeth brought intelligence, culture, and emotional tact to a court that badly needed all three. She made an impression not by spectacle, but by gentleness sharpened with awareness. Historians remain divided on how to read her. Some see her mostly as a tragic decorative figure, dead too early to matter on her own terms. Others argue that she softened Philip, influenced court tone, and represented a subtler kind of female power, one rooted in personal effect rather than office. Either way, her place in this story is clear. She became one more woman absorbed into a dynasty more concerned with continuity than vitality, more interested in preserving lines than protecting lives. Now the scene moves eastward into the colder courts of Central Europe, where the Habsburg pattern takes on a quieter but no less revealing form. Here we meet Barbara of Austria. Barbara is not among the most famous women in this story. She tends to disappear behind bigger names and louder scandals. But that makes her useful. Through her, we can see how the same dynastic logic extended far beyond the most iconic queens. The system was not limited to a few notorious marriages. It was everywhere. Barbara was born in 1539, the daughter of Ferdinand I, Holy Roman Emperor, and Anna of Bohemia and Hungary. Her parents, unsurprisingly, were related through the same broad aristocratic network that linked much of Europe's elite. By the time Barbara came of age, the Habsburg family had become not only politically expansive, but genetically repetitive. Still, she grew up in Vienna in an intellectually active court, surrounded by music, scholars, diplomats, and the cultivated Catholic seriousness typical of the dynasty. She was well-educated, multilingual, and by at least one account, had the kind of watchful expression that suggested she understood more than people expected. When she reached marriageable age,
She was, like so many others, evaluated and placed. She was eventually married to Alfonso II d'Este, Duke of Ferrara. This was not as tightly consanguineous as some of the more extreme Habsburg matches, but the bloodlines still overlapped through the wider network of noble kinship.
The point was familiar. Reinforce political ties while keeping rank and legitimacy within acceptable hereditary bounds. From the outside, Barbara's marriage looked respectable enough. She arrived in Ferrara with all the expected ceremony, attended to charity, patronage, and religion, and seemed to settle into ducal life properly. But Barbara was not content to exist as decoration. She involved herself in court management, followed political developments closely, and gained a reputation for quiet but real influence. One Venetian ambassador described her as the whisper behind the throne, which is exactly the kind of phrase history uses when a woman is visibly important, but men still want the throne itself to remain the official center of gravity. Barbara appears to have been sharper than many around her. She read the political field well, understood Habsburg interests, and intervened where she could. When advisors around Alfonso moved in directions she disliked, she worked through correspondence and influence rather than spectacle. And like so many royal women, her body eventually became the site of both pressure and failure. Barbara never produced a surviving heir. She reportedly suffered miscarriages, and her inability to give Ferrara a child became a source of court gossip. As usual, blame drifted toward the woman, even though Alfonso himself may have had fertility problems. That irony never disappears in these stories. A marriage arranged partly for bloodline continuation, and then the biology refuses to cooperate. She also suffered ongoing health problems: chronic fatigue, stomach pains, fainting spells, general weakness. All the vague labels that early modern courts loved because they explained everything and nothing. Modern historians have suggested possibilities ranging from autoimmune disease to chronic infection to hereditary fragility. No one can say for certain. What matters is the pattern. Even in less dramatic cases, Habsburg women repeatedly appear in the record as physically worn down, medically mysterious, and expected to continue anyway. One wonderfully odd personal detail about Barbara is her attachment to astrology. She kept a private astrologer, followed planetary signs, and was known to postpone important decisions if the stars felt wrong. In a world where science, devotion, medicine, and superstition all overlapped, this was not entirely absurd, but it still makes her feel unexpectedly alive. You can picture her delaying a treaty because the sky did not look favorable enough. Her health worsened steadily, and in 1572, she died at only 32 years old. Alfonso gave her the proper honors, then remarried soon after, because dynastic business never rests for long. Historians differ on how much significance to grant Barbara. Some treat her as a minor duchess in the wider Habsburg network. Others see, beneath the quieter surface, a politically capable woman who managed influence carefully and preserved her dignity inside a system designed to use and replace her. That second reading feels closer to the truth. Barbara matters because she reminds us that not every royal woman in this hereditary system was flamboyant, infamous, or dramatically tragic. Some were quieter. Some worked in the margins. Some governed through tact, correspondence, and observation. And some, like Barbara,
left behind a legacy visible only if you know where to look. From here, the story reaches back further into the earlier medieval roots of this whole pattern, into a world before the Habsburgs fully turned dynastic repetition into a recognizable family art. That next stop is Constance of Aragon. Now we move farther back in time, before the Habsburgs fully turned dynastic entanglement into a recognizable family signature, and arrive in the dry, bright, politically restless world of medieval Sicily. Here we meet Constance of Aragon.
She is important not because she represents the most extreme case of inbreeding in this story, but because she belongs to the earlier blueprint. In her life, you can already see the habits taking shape: the repeated cousin marriages, the use of daughters as political connectors, the quiet expectation that blood should circulate within a narrow aristocratic world until it begins to loop back on itself. Constance was born in 1179 to Alfonso II of Aragon and Sancha of Castile. And yes, as by now almost feels inevitable, her parents were related. The houses of Aragon and Castile had already been intermarrying for generations, long before the Habsburgs made dynastic recycling look like a science experiment. Iberian royalty had been blending and reblending the same lines into one another so consistently that even modern historians sometimes need diagrams just to keep everyone in order. So Constance entered the world already carrying a family history that bent inward. She was royal, politically useful, and therefore destined to be married where strategy required. That strategy eventually led her to Frederick II, heir to Sicily and the Holy Roman Empire. Their marriage in 1209 was not some romantic union of distant courts. It was a carefully positioned alliance, linking Aragonese prestige with imperial ambition. Frederick was one of those rulers who seems larger than life even on the page: brilliant, suspicious, intellectually restless, perpetually entangled with popes, princes, and enemies. His court in Palermo would become famous for its cosmopolitan atmosphere, for philosophy, astronomy, and medicine. But like all royal husbands in this story, he also came with pressure, instability, and the expectation that his wife's body would serve the dynasty first. Constance, however, was not a teenage bride. She was around 30 when she married Frederick, which already made her unusual by royal standards. That age gave her an advantage. She was not entering marriage as a child to be instructed. She was entering as an adult woman with awareness, education, and a clearer understanding of the game around her. She became Queen of Sicily and later Empress. And while she never achieved the dramatic reputation of some later women in this story, she seems to have been quietly effective. When Frederick was absent, which happened often because his reign was one long political storm, Constance acted as regent in Sicily. She issued decrees, handled disputes, managed court affairs, and kept the kingdom steadier than one might expect under the circumstances. That matters. In a world where royal women were often described as decorative or passive, Constance appears in the record as one of those calm administrative figures who held structures together while men pursued glory, conflict, or theological arguments across half of Europe. There is also the hereditary angle. The Hohenstaufen line Frederick came from, like the Aragonese line Constance belonged to, had already been marrying within a fairly narrow circle of noble families. So while their union may not shock in the same visceral way as later uncle-niece marriages,
it still deepened the same aristocratic pattern. Power preserved by keeping blood close. Their son, Henry VII of Germany, would later display troubling instability, periods of depression, erratic behavior, and eventual ruin. Historians still debate how much of that reflected personality, politics, circumstance, or heredity. But as with so many descendants in these interwoven lines, the question never fully disappears. One unusually vivid detail about Constance is her reported interest in astronomy. At Frederick's Sicilian court, where intellectual exchange flourished more than in many other royal settings, she is said to have attended celestial lectures and spent evenings on palace terraces looking at the stars while musicians played nearby.
It gives her story a strange calmness, as if for a few moments she stepped outside the suffocating logic of dynastic duty and into something wider. But even that wider sky did not spare her from the familiar toll. Years of stress, repeated pregnancies, and the constant burden of political life wore her down. Sources suggest she suffered a gradual physical decline, something described vaguely as a wasting of the body. Today we might suspect chronic illness, a degenerative condition, or simply the slow collapse of a body overused by expectation. She died in 1222, only a few years after becoming empress. And then, as so often happened, the dynasty moved on. Frederick remarried. The politics continued. The bloodline carried forward. Constance faded into the margins, remembered more as part of a line than as a ruler in her own right. Still, she matters. She shows us that the habits that later became infamous were already old. The Habsburgs did not invent the logic of dynastic repetition. They inherited it, intensified it, and ultimately pushed it toward collapse. From Constance, we cross the Channel and enter another political world entirely. England, Burgundy, and the turbulence of the late 15th century. Now we meet Margaret of York. Margaret is different from many of the women we've followed. She was not herself one of the most inbred figures in this story. Instead, she stands at the edge of the Habsburg machine and then steps directly into it. Her significance lies less in what she inherited than in what she helped make possible. Margaret was born in 1446, daughter of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, during the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. Her childhood was shaped by conflict, instability, shifting crowns, and the brutal reality of English dynastic struggle. Her father died in battle. Her brothers would become kings, one triumphantly, one briefly and disastrously. Margaret learned young that royal blood was not a blessing so much as an ongoing risk. Still, she was highly valuable in the marriage market. She was educated, poised, politically useful, and connected to the English throne. Eventually, in 1468, she married Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Burgundy at that point was one of Europe's richest and most glamorous courts, suspended between France and the Holy Roman Empire, wealthy enough to glitter like a kingdom and unstable enough to collapse at any moment. Margaret stepped into that world as duchess, and though her marriage was politically important, it did not produce children. Historians still debate why. It may have been infertility, stress, timing, or Charles himself. But no heir came from the marriage, and in dynastic politics, that absence always matters. When Charles died in battle in 1477, Margaret did not vanish into widowhood. Instead, she became one of the most important surviving figures in the Burgundian succession crisis. Charles's daughter from an earlier marriage, Marie of Burgundy, suddenly became the great prize everyone wanted to control. And it was Margaret who helped guide Marie toward marriage with Maximilian of Habsburg. That choice changed Europe. Without Margaret's support and political influence, Burgundy might have fallen more fully into French hands. Instead, Marie married Maximilian, and the Habsburgs acquired the Burgundian inheritance. The Low Countries, the Burgundian legacy, and the imperial future all began tying themselves together in a new configuration, one that would eventually produce Philip the Handsome, Joanna of Castile, Charles V, and the full flowering of the Habsburg dynastic machine. So Margaret, even without giving birth to heirs herself, became one of the architects of the hereditary future we've been tracing. She stayed in the Netherlands, acted as an influential court presence, advised younger generations, and lived long enough to watch the first signs of the Habsburg entanglement become visible. That must have been strange to witness. She had come from England's brutal but comparatively open dynastic conflicts, wars, rebellions, unstable claims. And now she stood in a court where power was being secured less through battle than through ever tighter marriage circles. She watched the children of these unions grow up. She heard the whispers around Joanna. She saw the first threads winding into the larger knot. One intriguing detail about Margaret is her devotion to Saint Colette and her private spiritual life. She kept a room for prayer, and at least one source notes that she lived beneath a ceiling painted with the genealogy of Christ. There is something almost too perfect in that image. Lineage literally overhead, sanctified and ever-present. Margaret died in 1503, having outlived her husband, stepdaughter, and many of the children she influenced. She was not herself the product of the worst hereditary narrowing, but she stood close enough to it to help shape its future. And from there, the story turns toward the 18th century, where the old dynastic habits continue under powdered wigs, polished manners, and a more theatrical kind of court culture. Now we arrive at the grandmothers of Marie Antoinette. This part of the story matters because by the 18th century, the old Habsburg and Bourbon worlds had not abandoned dynastic repetition. They had refined it. They dressed it in elegance, diplomacy, and Enlightenment language. But underneath the silk and political sophistication, the same hereditary logic remained. Let's begin with Elizabeth Farnese. Born in 1692, Elizabeth was herself already the product of cousin marriage. She grew up in Parma, politically ambitious and highly conscious of her value. In 1714, she married Philip V of Spain, the first Bourbon king of Spain after the fall of the Spanish Habsburg line. This was supposed to signal a new phase, a reboot of Spanish monarchy after the hereditary disaster of Charles II. But even here, the old habits lingered. Elizabeth and Philip were related through the broader network of Bourbon and Habsburg-connected aristocracy, and their marriage still served the same old purpose: preserve rank, preserve legitimacy, preserve dynastic cohesion. Elizabeth was no passive queen. She quickly became a dominant force in Spanish politics and worked aggressively to place her children on as many thrones as possible. Naples, Parma, Italy more broadly, she thought in terms of dynastic expansion at all times.
One of her daughters, Maria Theresa Rafaela of Spain, was married to the French Dauphin, once again looping Bourbon blood back into Bourbon blood. She died very young from childbirth complications. One more royal woman spent in service to succession before adulthood had barely finished. And then, standing on the Austrian side of the same future, there was Maria Theresa of Austria. Yes, the formidable empress, and yes, Marie Antoinette's mother. Maria Theresa is often remembered as powerful, practical, fertile, and politically skilled, which she certainly was. But even her success existed inside the larger dynastic pattern. She married Francis of Lorraine, which did open the line outward more than some earlier Habsburg marriages had. Yet the old obsession with strategic blood mapping remained very much alive. She had 16 children, and used them exactly as dynasties had always used daughters and sons, as political instruments. One daughter to Naples, another to Parma, another to Modena, and eventually Marie Antoinette to France. By this point, the Habsburg and Bourbon houses were tied together through multiple overlapping generations. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were not random royal strangers meeting across borders. They were relatives through several shared ancestors. Their family trees, like so many before them, leaned toward one another until the branches all but touched. And the signs of dynastic strain had not fully vanished.
Difficulty conceiving, court anxiety, unhealthy children, emotional fragility, recurrent illness, all of it remained part of the atmosphere. Historians still argue about how much this was heredity and how much was simply the tragic norm of pre-modern monarchy. But by the time you look at enough generations in sequence, the pattern becomes difficult to dismiss entirely. One particularly strange and memorable detail concerns Elizabeth Christine, another ancestral figure in Marie Antoinette's line. She was known for keeping peacocks as pets and claimed their cries reminded her of the sorrow of the Virgin Mary. It tells you a lot about the emotional tone of these courts. Symbolic, grand, melancholy, and deeply theatrical, even in private devotion. What makes this stage of the story especially tragic is that these grandmothers were not empty figures. Elizabeth Farnese was politically forceful. Maria Theresa of Austria was one of the most formidable rulers in Europe. These women were clever, strategic, and fully engaged with power. And yet even they operated inside the same hereditary cage. They arranged marriages, calculated claims, and thought in generations. But the bodies that carried those generations were still expected to endure repeated childbirth, dynastic duty, and emotional erasure. Daughters died in labor. Sons grew fragile. Heirs became difficult to produce. And still the machine kept moving. This is what makes Marie Antoinette's later fate feel less like a sudden tragedy and more like the delayed consequence of a system that had been wobbling for centuries. The women before her did not create that system from nothing, but they were trapped in it, sustained it, and were consumed by it all at once. And now, after tracing crowns, treaties, and marriages, we move behind the public facade and into the quieter spaces where the real cost was often paid. Bedchambers, nurseries, sick rooms, and the private silences between pregnancy and grief. That is where the next part goes. Now the royal proclamations fade into the background, and we slip behind the throne room doors into a quieter, sadder world. The world of bedchambers, miscarriages, nursery curtains, long illnesses, and grief that rarely made it into official portraits. Because for all the crowns, jewels, and painted ceremony, this is where the true cost of dynastic obsession was often paid. Not in battle, not in coronation halls, but in private rooms where royal women bled, prayed, buried infants, and were expected to recover quickly enough to begin again. One of the hardest truths running through this entire story is that childbirth was not a side duty for queens and princesses. It was their central labor. Their political worth depended on it, and failure was treated not simply as sorrow, but as weakness, even when that failure meant repeated pregnancy loss, stillbirth, or children too fragile to live. The records often soften it with polite phrasing. A queen was said to be indisposed. A child was not preserved. A hoped-for heir did not thrive. But behind those delicate phrases were bodies broken by pregnancy and families shaped by chronic death. Take Catherine of Aragon, for instance. As we've already seen, she was pregnant multiple times during her marriage to Henry VIII. Only Mary Tudor survived to adulthood. The rest ended in miscarriage, stillbirth, or early infant death. One son lived only a matter of weeks. Catherine carried not only physical pain, but also the unbearable weight of believing that God might be punishing her. In a world without genetics, blood type science, or reproductive medicine, royal women were left with theology, guilt, and ritual. So Catherine prayed harder, fasted harder, blamed herself more deeply. And she was far from alone. Joanna of Castile suffered miscarriages. Isabella of Portugal lost children. Barbara of Austria likely miscarried repeatedly. Many others did too, even when the record barely lets their losses breathe on the page. The repetition is what becomes chilling. So many pregnancies. So many infants baptized and buried almost immediately. So many nurseries arranged for children who never had the chance to grow into them. Royal courts quietly adapted to this reality. Cradles and mourning cloths existed almost side by side. Midwives were expected to assist with birth and then, if necessary, prepare a body for burial. In some courts, baby clothes and funeral linens were kept close together because no one could fully trust which would be needed. That detail alone tells you how normalized the abnormal had become. And then there were the illnesses. Not the dramatic, easy-to-name illnesses that historians love because they sound neat and conclusive, but the vague, recurring, deeply unsettling ones. Chronic headaches, muscle wasting, fainting, melancholy, strange fevers that came and went, hallucinations, exhaustion that never fully lifted, swollen limbs, sleeplessness, nervous collapse. Some of it was clearly the result of pre-modern medicine, infection, malnutrition, postpartum trauma, or the general horror of living inside a rigid court system. But increasingly, modern scholars have asked whether these symptoms were also signs of hereditary weakness compounded by repeated close-kin marriage. That question matters because these were not isolated cases. They appear again and again across dynasties that repeatedly turned inward. Take Anna of Austria, Philip II's niece-wife. Her letters and descriptions suggest deep fatigue, emotional instability, anxiety,
and what a modern observer might interpret as postpartum depression. She died young after repeated pregnancies. At the time, of course, no one called it that. It was simply illness, weakness. Another queen fading quietly after doing what was expected. Or consider Isabella of Bourbon, mother of Marie of Burgundy. She suffered recurring fevers after childbirth that never seemed to have fully left her. Some historians have suggested an autoimmune disorder. Others suspect chronic infection. Still others point toward inherited vulnerability aggravated by pregnancy. Whatever the exact diagnosis, the pattern feels familiar by now. Noble blood, repeated reproductive strain, and a body that slowly gives up. And then the record becomes darker. There are women who appear to slide not just into sickness, but into mental collapse. They scream, refuse to eat, speak to no one, become convinced of things others cannot see. Some are isolated, some are quietly removed. Some are branded unstable, unfit, or cursed. The most famous example remains Joanna of Castile, but she is not the only one. She is simply the one history remembered most clearly. What we cannot always know is whether these women were suffering from grief, trauma, hormonal collapse, neurological disease, psychiatric illness, or some mix of all four. And because they came from lines already tightened by generations of intermarriage, heredity always lurks in the background like an unanswered question. One especially unsettling example appears in accounts of Eleanor of Austria, sister to Charles V. Some records describe her enduring severe insomnia, confusion, and episodes attributed by doctors to womb-driven disturbance, one of those old medical phrases that sounds absurd now, but once carried real authority. The treatments were exactly what you might fear: bleeding, isolation, prayer, and silence. These women were expected to be sacred and reproductive at the same time. If they failed to conceive, they were suspected. If they conceived and lost the child, they were pitied but still pressured. If they showed signs of emotional collapse, they were pathologized. If they survived long enough to continue, the cycle simply began again. And then, of course, there were the children who did live, or rather, half-lived.
So many royal infants were described as delicate, weak, or strangely underdeveloped. Some had seizures, some bled excessively from minor injuries, some were slow to speak or walk. Some seemed to have had facial abnormalities, poor muscle tone, or coordination problems. Some were simply hidden from public view and then vanished from the record a few years later. The vocabulary of the time is frustratingly vague. Words like rickety, wasting, frail, or tender constitution appear again and again. Modern historians suspect that beneath those phrases may have been a range of inherited disorders, immune dysfunctions, endocrine problems, or other genetic conditions worsened by close kin marriage. One detail from the Austrian court is particularly haunting. In the 17th century, miniature coffins for children were sometimes prepared in advance. Tiny painted caskets, decorated with angels, crests, and soft fabrics, waited near the nursery because infant death had become so common that preparation itself was part of court routine. That is what dynastic fragility looks like when it becomes domestic. Not just in portraits with strange faces or in genealogical charts, but in furniture built for children expected to die.
Modern historians still argue over how much of this can be blamed directly on inbreeding. Some say poor sanitation, repeated pregnancies, and the absence of antibiotics explain more than people want to admit. That is certainly true to an extent. Pre-modern life was dangerous for everyone, and especially for women in childbirth. But others point out that the repeated cousin and uncle-niece marriages in the Spanish, Austrian, and related noble lines clearly increased the risk of recessive conditions, weakened health, and reproductive difficulty. The question is not whether all suffering came from heredity. It is whether heredity made an already brutal system even deadlier. And it seems increasingly hard to deny that it did.
What remains most striking, though, is the emotional loneliness. Royal women were expected to produce heirs, survive childbirth, and return to ceremony looking serene. When they failed, court gossip sharpened, husbands strayed, advisors whispered, priests sermonized. The women themselves rarely left behind detailed emotional confessions. What survives are fragments, a tired line in a letter, a note in a prayer book, a witness saying the queen wept alone. That phrase holds almost the entire tragedy. The queen wept alone. And from those private rooms of grief and physical breakdown, we now move toward the most visible symbol of dynastic decline, the physical feature that came to stand for the Habsburg line more than any crown, banner, or title ever could. The Habsburg jaw. Few inherited traits in European history have become as famous as this one. You have probably seen it in portraits without even thinking about its medical meaning. The long face, the jutting lower jaw, the heavy underbite, the chin so pronounced it seems to shape the whole expression before the eyes can. In mild form, it could be passed off as a strong profile. In severe form, it became a visible warning. The technical term is mandibular prognathism, a condition in which the lower jaw extends beyond the upper one. In later Habsburgs, especially the Spanish branch, it became so pronounced that it interfered with chewing, speech, and even facial closure. It was not merely an aesthetic issue. In extreme cases, it was debilitating. Modern researchers have studied portraits, genealogy, and skeletal remains to trace the trait across generations. And what they found is almost too fitting. The more tightly inbred the line, the more severe the jaw tended to become. It is one of the rare instances in royal history where the metaphor and the biology align so neatly. But what is especially important for this story is that women carried it too. Men could sometimes wear a heavy jaw as a sign of strength, severity, or dynastic authority. For women, the consequences were harsher. Beauty mattered. Marriage politics depended partly on presentation. A princess with too strong a jaw could not so easily be romanticized. And so painters began trying to soften it. You can see the effort in portraiture. Shadows lengthen strategically. Faces are turned at flattering angles. Lips are painted carefully. Chin lines are blurred. Artists were not merely making people attractive. They were trying to preserve dynastic dignity. Take Isabella Clara Eugenia. In her earlier portraits, the jaw is present but manageable, almost understated. She still appears poised, elegant, controlled. But as the generations continue, the feature becomes harder to disguise. In later Habsburg women, especially those from the most tightly intermarried Spanish lines, the face begins to look increasingly strained by inherited repetition.
Mariana of Austria, niece and wife of Philip IV, is one of the most cited examples. Contemporary observers commented on her elongated lower face, even in a court culture that usually avoided blunt criticism of royal appearance. Descriptions tried to stay polite, but the discomfort shows through. Her jaw was not merely strong, it was conspicuous. And through her, that trait moved forward into the body of Charles II of Spain, where it reached its most catastrophic form. But before we get to Charles, it matters to pause here and see what this feature meant for the women who carried it. These were not grotesque caricatures. They were women born into systems that treated their bodies as dynastic vessels. They did not choose the marriages that compounded the trait. They inherited it, lived inside it, and passed it on because that was what the structure required.
One of the most fascinating modern findings comes from a 2009 study that analyzed the faces of Habsburg rulers and compared the severity of mandibular prognathism with the degree of genealogical inbreeding. The correlation was strong. In simple terms, the more repeated cousin marriages in the ancestry, the more pronounced the jaw. And it was rarely just the jaw. Researchers and historians also point to associated traits: narrow palates, drooping lower lips, widened eyes, elongated noses, dental crowding, speech difficulties, and other craniofacial irregularities. Some royal children may have suffered chronic pain or trouble eating from a very young age. In women, those same traits could quietly affect marriage prospects, self-image, and how portraitists chose to depict them. There is also a strange cultural afterlife to the Habsburg jaw. By the 18th century, especially outside Spain, it had become a subject of satire. Political cartoons exaggerated it. Pamphlets used it as shorthand for aristocratic decay. In some depictions, a noble face with an absurdly long chin stood for everything critics hated about dynastic arrogance. Too much pride, too much inherited power, too little common sense. And yet the jaw alone was never the full story. Some historians caution against turning it into too neat a symbol. A prominent chin does not automatically mean a collapsing dynasty. Some Habsburg women with strong jaws were healthy, intelligent, and politically capable. The jaw became famous in part because it was visible, but behind it stood deeper problems: fertility issues, neurological vulnerability, immune weakness, developmental problems, and the relentless narrowing of the hereditary pool. That is why the trait remains so haunting. It is the visible tip of a much larger invisible structure. These women stood in portraits wearing velvet, pearls, and brocade, their faces arranged into calm dignity. But under those polished surfaces sat the accumulated cost of generations. The chins, mouths, and bones had become political evidence. A dynasty writing its own history into the architecture of the face. And now the story turns from bone and portrait back toward argument. Because once you start tracing these physical signs, one big question returns. What really brought these dynasties down? Was it inbreeding? Was it politics? Was it war, religion, money, stress, propaganda, or simple historical bad luck dressed in a dramatic family resemblance? That is where the next part goes. Now we step away from portraits, coffins, marriage contracts, and the visible drama of dynastic decline, and enter a more uncertain space, the place where historians,
doctors, and modern scholars still argue over what exactly brought these ruling families down. Because once you begin tracing repeated cousin marriages, physical traits, miscarriages, mental collapse, and failed heirs, one huge question rises from the background and refuses to leave. Was inbreeding really the cause of royal decline? Or has history made the story neater than reality ever was? This is where the debate grows more complicated. It is easy, perhaps too easy, to tell the story this way. Dynasties married themselves into a genetic corner. Their heirs became weak, unstable, or infertile, and the whole system eventually collapsed under the weight of its own blood. There is truth in that story, but only part of the truth. Take Joanna of Castile again, the woman history branded the Mad. She remains one of the most cited examples whenever people try to connect royal heredity and mental instability. She talked to the dead, clung to her husband's corpse, and spent much of her life imprisoned while male relatives governed in her name. Some historians believe Joanna may indeed have suffered from a hereditary mood disorder, perhaps bipolar disorder, or another serious psychiatric condition intensified by stress.
Others think what we are seeing is not straightforward mental illness at all, but a woman pushed beyond endurance by grief, isolation, childbirth, betrayal, and political imprisonment. And that distinction matters. Because if Joanna was genetically unwell, then she becomes one of the clearest early examples of hereditary fragility in Europe's ruling lines. But if her madness was exaggerated or manipulated by the men around her, then her story reveals something else entirely. How easily royal women could be turned into medicalized scapegoats whenever power needed to move around them. That same uncertainty appears elsewhere. Consider Charles VI of France, the king who famously believed he was made of glass and might shatter if touched. It is one of the strangest royal episodes in European history. Was it hereditary mental illness? Was it stress? Was it the crushing strain of kingship in a fractured kingdom? Or some blend of everything? Even now, scholars still disagree. Then there is Charles II of Spain, the final Spanish Habsburg, whose body and mind became symbols of dynastic collapse. We will come back to him in full, but even in his case, the debate is not entirely closed. Everyone agrees he was physically frail and deeply compromised. What remains contested is whether he should be understood as the near inevitable genetic result of generations of close kin marriage, or as a man whose inherited weaknesses were worsened by poor medicine, superstition, isolation, and the crushing expectations of kingship. The same questions appear in discussions of fertility. Was the wave of miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths among royal women really caused by inbreeding? Or was that simply the tragic baseline of pre-modern life? That is a fair question, because childbirth was dangerous for everyone, not just queens. Common women died in labor. Common infants died in staggering numbers. Illness, infection, malnutrition, and the complete absence of useful obstetric science made reproduction a brutal gamble across every class. And yet, when you look at royal women generation after generation, something still stands out. Catherine of Aragon loses child after child. Isabella of Portugal suffers repeated reproductive tragedy. Barbara of Austria likely miscarries. Anna of Austria dies after repeated pregnancies.
Across the Habsburgs, Bourbons, and their close dynastic allies, the same pattern repeats with unnerving regularity. Modern geneticists have tried to move this question out of pure speculation by calculating inbreeding coefficients, numbers that estimate how closely related someone's parents were and how likely it is that inherited traits are doubled through a shared ancestor. The average person sits close to 0, but in these dynasties, the numbers climb. Some royal figures landed in ranges roughly comparable to first cousin unions, already a meaningful increase in risk. And Charles II of Spain reached approximately 0.25, a level comparable to the child of siblings. That is not court rumor. That is mathematical genealogy. And yet, even that does not solve everything, because a number can tell you the degree of hereditary compression, but it cannot by itself explain the whole collapse of a kingdom. Critics of the genetic explanation point this out often, and not without reason. They argue that modern observers love a neat villain. Inbreeding is neat. It is visible. It gives decline a face, a number, a shape. It lets us point at a jawline or a miserable marriage and say, there, that is what destroyed them. But states do not collapse for one reason. The Spanish monarchy was not weakened only by hereditary fragility. It was also strained by imperial overreach, financial exhaustion, military commitments, religious conflict, administrative burden, court factionalism, and a changing European balance of power.
France did not drift toward revolution because Marie Antoinette's bloodline was flawed. It drifted there because the kingdom was deeply unequal, financially broken, politically rigid, and unable to respond to the pressures building beneath it. So the wiser reading is not that inbreeding caused everything. It is that inbreeding made an already unstable system more brittle. And then there is propaganda. This matters a great deal, especially for royal women. If a queen was politically inconvenient, one of the easiest ways to discredit her was to call her unstable, malformed, barren, cold, excessive, hysterical, or somehow biologically unfit. These labels did not always reflect objective reality. They reflected court politics. A foreign queen at court was especially vulnerable. If she was shy, she became arrogant. If she grieved, she became unstable. If she miscarried, she became cursed. If she failed to charm a hostile court, she became dull or defective. That is why so many historians urge caution. Maria Theresa of Spain was described by some French observers as slow, heavy, and socially awkward. But those same observers were writing from a court that had every reason to mock Spanish austerity and diminish a queen who did not fit Versailles. Elizabeth of Valois was at times described as fragile or emotionally unstable. But much of that may simply reflect the fact that she was a teenager in a suffocating court, married to a far older and emotionally inaccessible king. Even the famous Habsburg jaw is not entirely free from this problem. Yes, the trait was real. Yes, modern studies suggest a measurable link between facial structure and the degree of dynastic inbreeding. But portraits are not medical scans. Painters flattered, stylized, emphasized certain features to signal nobility, lineage, and family resemblance. Once the Habsburg face became recognizable, artists may have leaned into it,
and later observers may have exaggerated it further in memory.
In other words, the jaw became not just an anatomical trait, but a symbol. And symbols have a way of growing sharper in hindsight. By the 19th century, long after the Spanish Habsburg line had ended, racial theorists and pseudoscientific writers began using the Habsburg jaw as a cultural warning sign. To them, it became proof of what happened when aristocracies tried to preserve purity too aggressively. It drifted out of dynastic history and into caricature, medical folklore, satire, and eventually popular imagination. So where does all that leave us? Probably somewhere between biology and theater. Yes, repeated close-kin marriage created real hereditary risks. Yes, the dynasties that practiced it most intensely seem to have accumulated physical, psychological, and reproductive problems over time. Yes, the evidence surrounding figures like Charles II is too strong to dismiss. But no, not every royal woman who miscarried was the victim of some direct genetic curse. Not every melancholy queen was proof of hereditary madness. And not every collapse can be mapped neatly onto a family tree. Sometimes a kingdom was badly governed. Sometimes a queen was trapped. Sometimes grief looked like illness. Sometimes illness was real but misunderstood. And often, the tragedy came from the fact that all of these forces were working at once. Still, one truth remains hard to escape. When a dynasty becomes obsessed with preserving itself through blood, it begins to narrow its own future. Even if politics, war, or finance finally deliver the fatal blow, heredity can make the structure weaker long before the fall. And now we move into the final tightening of that structure. Because after the debate, after the theories, after the medical language and scholarly caution, there is still the human end of the story. The women whose bodies carried the last phase of this dynastic experiment. These were not just queens and brides. They were the final biological links in a chain that had been tightened for centuries. And now we begin with one of the most important of them, Mariana of Austria. If this story has been building like a spiral, Mariana stands near the point where the spiral closes. She was born in 1634, daughter of Maria Anna of Spain and Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor. That alone already placed her deep within the Habsburg web. But her future would take the family entanglement one step further. She was married to Philip IV of Spain, who was not just her king, but her uncle. Again, uncle and niece. By this point, the Spanish and Austrian Habsburg branches had spent so long marrying inward that such unions no longer felt extraordinary inside the dynasty. They were simply efficient. The goal was to keep claims, status, and legitimacy sealed inside the family from every direction. Mariana's marriage to Philip was meant to secure that continuity. Instead, it helped produce its final catastrophe. She had several children with Philip, but only one surviving son would matter historically above all others: Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg ruler of the Spanish line. From the very beginning, Charles showed signs that something was terribly wrong. He struggled to feed. He developed slowly. He could not walk or speak on time. His body was visibly fragile, and the court knew it. Everyone could see it.
What they could not admit openly was what his conditions suggested about the dynasty itself. Mariana loved him fiercely. That point matters, because history often remembers her only as the mother of a failed king, or as a regent tangled in factional court politics. But from every indication, she was deeply attached to Charles and determined to preserve both him and the crown around him. After Philip IV died, Mariana became regent for her son. And this is one of the reasons she deserves more attention than she usually gets.
She was not merely a reproductive vessel left behind after the heir was born. She governed, and she governed in chaos. Spain was already exhausted, financially, militarily, and politically. Court factions tore at each other. Foreign powers watched closely. Clergy, ministers, and noble interests all tried to influence the boy king and the regency around him. Mariana had to manage all of this while protecting a son whose body itself had become evidence of dynastic failure. That is a brutal role. She is often described as pious, rigid, serious, and heavily dependent on confessors and advisors. Some accounts mock her for this, but one could also read it differently. She was a woman trying to hold together a court, a child, and a kingdom in conditions that would have broken almost anyone. Her daughter, Margaret Teresa of Spain, also became part of this same hereditary disaster. Margaret, the girl immortalized in Velázquez's Las Meninas, was married off to her maternal uncle, Leopold I. So the pattern did not stop. It repeated. She was still a teenager. The match was celebrated with all the pageantry dynasties love to use when they are walking directly toward danger. Margaret had several children, only one of whom survived infancy, and she died at just 21, likely from pregnancy complications. The beauty and delicacy that painters captured in youth dissolved into the familiar royal pattern: repeated pregnancy, dynastic pressure, physical breakdown, early death. And that is what makes these final Habsburg women so tragic. They were not passive dolls drifting toward inevitable ruin. Many were intelligent, capable, devout, politically aware, and active in governance. Mariana ruled as regent. Margaret corresponded with thinkers and was treated as a dynastic jewel. Other late Habsburg women funded religious institutions, supported learning, and handled court power with real skill. They were not empty figures, but none of that could save them from the hereditary machinery they had inherited. That machinery had become too tight, too repetitive, too biologically unforgiving. One physician during Charles II's time reportedly suggested that the only real cure for the royal line would be to introduce fresh blood through marriage to someone outside the usual closed aristocratic circle, even, scandalously, a woman of more modest birth. He was dismissed, but the idea was not wrong. By then, however, it was too late. The line had already narrowed to its breaking point, and in the center of that narrowing stood women like Mariana, Margaret Teresa, Maria Anna, and others whose names fade in and out of history, each carrying the same burden: marry where you are told,
bear the child the dynasty needs, and pray that this time the body of the heir will hold. Too often, it did not. The next part goes even deeper into the strangest corners of these family trees. The marriages so tangled that a woman could be aunt, wife, cousin, and step relation at once. And after that comes the final figure toward whom everything has been moving. Charles II of Spain. The end of the line.
Now we enter the strangest corridors of all. The parts of royal genealogy where the family tree stops behaving like a tree and starts looking more like a knot pulled too tight. These are the fringe cases, the marriages that make even seasoned historians stop, blink, and reach for a chart. The moments when dynastic logic became so obsessive that a woman could end up related to her husband in 3 or 4 different ways at once, while court officials nodded along as if this were perfectly reasonable statecraft. Because once a dynasty becomes convinced that only its own blood is safe enough, noble enough, or sacred enough to preserve power, the choices narrow fast. And when the choices narrow, absurdity starts dressing itself as policy. One of the clearest examples is, once again, Anna of Austria. Yes, another Anna. The Habsburgs do love recycling both names and genes. Anna was the daughter of Maria of Spain and Maximilian II, and she became the 4th wife of Philip II of Spain. But she was not merely another Habsburg bride. She was Philip's niece, his sister's daughter. So when she married him, she became at once his wife, his niece, his dynastic solution, and yet another link in the increasingly suffocating chain of hereditary repetition. Their children were not just heirs in the usual royal sense. They were the products of a union so close in kinship that even Rome had to pause long enough to issue special permission. And still, the marriage went forward without real hesitation. That is what makes these cases so striking. The Church technically prohibited such close unions. Canon law existed. Degrees of prohibited kinship were known. But for powerful dynasties, those rules had become almost negotiable. A dispensation could be secured. A signature could be obtained. Another marriage could proceed. Bloodline came first. And Anna's case was not unique. The Habsburgs, in particular, became masters of multiple-role marriage, arrangements where one person might be cousin, niece, in-law, and dynastic remedy all at once. The goal was always the same: keep lands, claims, and legitimacy within the family, and prevent any outsider from gaining too much influence through marriage. In practice, this meant that family trees began folding in on themselves in ways that now seem almost surreal. Take Maria Antonia of Austria, for example, daughter of Leopold I and Margaret Teresa of Spain. She married Maximilian II Emmanuel of Bavaria, yet another dynastically suitable relative within the larger aristocratic web. These unions were so densely interconnected that even contemporary genealogists struggle to keep them straight. Court chroniclers sometimes had to explain relations with paragraphs instead of a simple title. And then there were cases where the same names repeated so often that the family tree became almost unreadable. Maria, Anna, Isabella, Philip, Charles, Ferdinand, Margaret. Again and again, each new child carrying not only the family blood, but the family naming habits, until multiple women in the same generation could bear nearly identical names and overlapping titles. Imagine a palace where several Maria Annas are all alive at once, each married into some other branch of the same greater dynasty,
each tied back by blood to the same handful of ancestors. That was not unusual. It was routine. One particularly uncomfortable pattern involved marriages between uncles and nieces, or proposals that nearly became such marriages. These were not accidental lapses or secret scandals. They were deliberate political strategies. A niece was already known, already Catholic, already dynastically useful, and already inside the circle. Why risk introducing an outsider when a relative could seal the same alliance more safely? That was the logic, and that logic kept winning.
There were also cases in which widowers married sisters or close female relatives of previous wives, partly to retain dowries, claims, or diplomatic continuity. In some dynastic settings, a woman might die and her sister would be quietly considered as a replacement, not because of personal preference, but because she fit the political structure without forcing anyone to redraw the map of alliances. The human being mattered less than the continuity of the arrangement. That is what makes all of this feel so claustrophobic. A royal woman was not only expected to marry strategically, she was expected to be interchangeable within the strategy, as long as the bloodlines stayed acceptable. Even more startling are the near misses, the proposals that did not happen only because politics shifted, not because anyone thought the kinship was too close. There were moments when women were considered for nephews, cousins already related through several other lines, or men whose place in the family web made the future children look like the result of genealogy trying to eat itself. And yet none of this was treated as grotesque at court. It was treated as loyalty. To marry close was to show faith in the house. To preserve blood was to preserve order. To keep inheritance from drifting outward was worth almost any private absurdity. One almost darkly comic feature of this world was the sheer bureaucratic effort required to explain it. Genealogical charts had to account not only for blood descent, but overlapping marriage ties, repeated names, and titles that bounced between the same families. Some lineages looked less like ancestry and more like braided rope. A court historian, trying to describe one such arrangement, essentially admitted that the blood was noble, even if the map had become almost impossible to follow. That may be the most honest sentence ever written about these dynasties. And it was not only monarchs doing this. Minor nobility across Europe often copied royal behavior. If kings and emperors were marrying cousins, why should dukes, counts, and lesser houses not do the same? So the pattern spread outward, turning whole layers of aristocratic society into a widening hereditary loop. The top of the system may have been the most visible, but the logic seeped downward. And then, eventually, reality answered back. Children were born weak. Marriages failed to produce heirs. Some lines narrowed too far. Some bodies no longer cooperated. Courts that had spent generations treating blood purity as a tool of strength began discovering that the tool had become a liability. That is what makes these fringe cases more than just curiosities. They are warnings. They show the point at which dynastic strategy stops looking like prudence and starts looking like desperation. And all of it leads, almost inevitably, toward the final figure in this story. Because if the Habsburg line had been tightening for generations, then Charles II of Spain was the moment when the knot finally held too hard and tore. Now the palace darkens. The tapestries feel heavier. The court seems quieter,
more brittle, full of ritual and worry. Every previous marriage, every repeated cousin union, every uncle-niece arrangement, every safe dynastic choice leads toward this one fragile king. Charles II was born in 1661 to Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, which means, as we've already seen, that he was the child of an uncle-niece marriage. But that alone does not capture the full scale of the hereditary collapse behind him. His ancestry was so tightly compressed by repeated intermarriage that his inbreeding coefficient has often been compared to that of a child born to siblings. In plain terms, the dynasty had gone too far, and Charles showed it from the beginning. He was slow to develop, physically weak, chronically ill, and visibly unlike what a strong ruling monarch was supposed to be.
He struggled with speech. He had difficulty walking. He suffered from recurring sickness and lacked the basic resilience expected even of an ordinary child, let alone a king raised at the center of an empire. The court saw it. The physicians saw it. His mother saw it. But no one could say aloud what it meant. Instead, the old explanations rushed in. Humors, weakness, divine testing, spiritual interference, malign influences. Charles was treated not only medically but ritually. Clergy, prayers, oils, relics, and superstitious remedies surrounded him, because when dynasties reach the point where biology becomes unbearable, they often retreat into religion and ceremonial hope. And still, he remained king. That is one of the strangest facts in the whole story. Even when a royal body was visibly failing, the crown stayed fixed to it. The system had no better answer. Charles's face became the most famous expression of the Habsburg jaw. In him, the long lower jaw and underbite were no longer simply a recognizable family feature. They were severe enough to interfere with daily life. Speaking clearly was difficult. Eating was difficult. Even the ordinary physical act of carrying himself with royal ease seems to have been beyond him for much of his life. And yet Charles was expected to stand for Spain. He was expected to embody monarchy, continuity, divine order, imperial legitimacy. He was expected to rule an exhausted empire while barely holding his own body together. That burden alone is tragic. He was married twice, because dynasties always hope for rescue through reproduction, even when every sign suggests the opposite. His first wife, Marie-Louise d'Orléans, was a French princess, young, lively, and by most accounts far healthier than the court she entered. Their marriage lasted years, but it produced no child. Court rumors swirled, as they always do. Blame the queen, blame the king, blame politics, blame poison, blame God. But no heir came. After her death, Charles married Mariana of Neuburg, in part because her family was famously fertile. The logic was brutally simple. Perhaps a woman from a prolific family could somehow force the line forward. But again, nothing. No surviving child, no recovery, no future. By adulthood, Charles had become a living symbol of dynastic exhaustion. He aged badly, weakened early, and seems to have carried not only physical suffering, but the eerie emotional atmosphere of a court fully aware that the line was ending in front of them. He was surrounded by anxiety, advisors, factions, desperate succession politics, and the unbearable knowledge that if he died childless, Europe would be thrown into chaos.
And that is exactly what happened. When Charles died in 1700, the Spanish Habsburg line ended. No son, no direct heir, no way to pretend the old strategy still worked. And with his death came the War of the Spanish Succession, because the moment the bloodline failed, Europe lunged at the inheritance. France, Austria, and other powers all moved to claim influence over what the Spanish crown left behind. So even in death, Charles's body remained political territory. Historians often treat him as the ultimate proof of dynastic inbreeding, and it is not hard to see why. He was the final visible consequence of centuries of hereditary narrowing. But there is also something deeply sad in the way history remembers him. He becomes a symbol so easily that the person almost disappears. He was not just the end of a line. He was a human being, born into a system that had no room for healthy escape. And behind him stood generations of women who had carried that system forward. Women who married where they were told, conceived under pressure, lost children, buried infants, and passed on bloodlines they did not design. That is why Charles matters in this story not only as a king, but as a conclusion. He is the dynasty made flesh, and the flesh could no longer sustain it.
With the death of Charles II, the long and troubled Spanish Habsburg line finally came to an end. For centuries, Europe's ruling houses had treated marriage like a tool for preserving order. Land, titles, legitimacy, and alliances were all folded into the same calculation. The safest match, they believed, was the one closest to home. A cousin kept the inheritance nearby. A niece kept the bloodline even tighter. A familiar house felt less dangerous than an ambitious outsider. And for a while, that logic seemed to work. Empires expanded. Courts glittered. Portraits grew more grand. Palaces filled with velvet, gold, silver thread, and the language of divine right. From a distance, these dynasties looked permanent, almost indestructible. But under the polished surface, the cost had been building quietly for generations. By the time Charles II died childless in 1700, the illusion could no longer hold. His death did not bring peace. It brought panic. Spain was still one of the great prizes of Europe, and now the question of succession exploded into open conflict. Competing powers rushed to claim what the broken Habsburg line could no longer secure through inheritance alone. France advanced the claims of Philip of Anjou. Austria backed the Habsburg Archduke Charles. Britain, the Dutch Republic, and other states watched nervously, knowing that whoever controlled Spain and its empire might reshape the balance of power across the continent. So the death of one fragile king became the beginning of a war that touched nearly all of Europe. The War of the Spanish Succession was, in one sense, about territory and diplomacy. But in another sense, it was the final political consequence of a hereditary strategy that had failed. For generations, royal families had married inward in the hope of preventing succession crises. In the end, they produced one of the biggest succession crises of all. That irony is almost too perfect. A dynasty that had tried hardest to preserve itself through bloodline control ultimately collapsed because it could no longer produce a viable future through that same method. And yet, the story does not end only in failure. Because after the fall of the Spanish Habsburgs, Europe began, slowly and unevenly, to change. Not out of sudden moral awakening,
Not because kings and courts suddenly developed compassion for the women they had used as dynastic instruments, and certainly not because anyone had a modern understanding of genetics. The change came because the danger had become too visible to ignore. No one wanted another Charles II. That mattered. Even when people could not explain the biology, they could recognize the result. Too many weak heirs, too many childless marriages, too many queens exhausted by repeated pregnancies, too many infants dying before the court could even decide which title to place over the cradle. Too many faces in portraits that looked eerily alike, as if the family itself had begun copying the same flawed design again and again. So royal strategy adapted, not completely, not immediately, but noticeably. The great courts of Europe began looking farther afield for marriages. French princes married outside their closest circles more often. Austrian Habsburgs brought in new houses. Spanish Bourbons, though still deeply invested in status and dynastic calculation, no longer operated with quite the same level of hereditary claustrophobia that had defined the late Habsburg line. Fresh blood, though never phrased in such blunt modern terms, became politically desirable, and that shift changed the women too. Not all at once, of course. Royal daughters were still bargaining pieces. They were still assessed for rank, fertility, religion, appearance, and family utility. But slowly, the role widened. Some women gained more education. Some gained more influence.
Some were allowed, at least in rare cases, to shape their own marriages or decline the most absurd arrangements. A few even married for affection, which in earlier centuries would have sounded dangerously unserious. One of the most striking later examples is Maria Theresa of Austria. She stands in an interesting place in this long story. She was still very much a dynastic ruler. She still thought in terms of marriage strategy, lineage, and alliance. She still married her children into Europe's great houses like pieces on a board. But she also lived in a world already edging toward a more modern political structure, a world of reform, bureaucracy, and statecraft that no longer relied quite so heavily on keeping every branch of power inside a tiny hereditary circle. Maria Theresa did not end dynastic politics, but she belonged to a phase in which dynastic politics had started to learn, however imperfectly, from its own disasters. Even the portraits changed. If you line up the painted faces of the earlier Habsburgs and compare them to those of later royal houses, the differences are impossible not to notice. The famous jaw begins to soften. The faces open. The repetition becomes less aggressive. Whether that was because of better marriage choices, artistic style, or both, the symbolic effect remains powerful. It looks as though Europe itself had begun trying to breathe again. Still, the old habits never fully disappeared. Royal families remained obsessed with lineage long after they had reason to be cautious. The British royal house, the Romanovs, the Bourbons, and others all continued to intermarry within a fairly limited circle of approved nobility.
Queen Victoria's descendants would later spread hemophilia through several European dynasties, proving that hereditary danger had not vanished at all. It had merely changed form. So the lesson of the Habsburgs was never learned perfectly, but it was learned enough. The women who came after the collapse stood in a different world from the women who had built it. They still lived under pressure. They still married for politics. They still carried the burden of succession in their bodies. But the system around them was gradually widening, and the older forms of dynastic suffocation were becoming harder to defend. Which brings us, strangely enough, back to the women we've followed all along. Because this story was never really only about kings. It was not only about Charles II, or Philip II, or Charles V, or the emperors and princes whose names dominate the official record. It was about the women behind the continuity. The women who were told that family duty required obedience. The women whose marriages closed the dynastic loops. The women who crossed borders as living peace treaties. The women who buried children, endured political isolation, and still had to appear at court in pearls and embroidered gowns, as though nothing inside them had broken. Some of them were brilliant rulers. Some were sharp diplomats. Some were deeply pious. Some were strategic. Some were melancholy. Some were resilient. Some were probably far angrier than the sources allow them to sound. But almost all of them lived inside a machine they did not build and could not easily refuse. That is what lingers after the genealogies and medical theories fade. Not just the strange marriages, not only the famous jaw, not the shock value of a niece marrying an uncle or a cousin producing yet another heir. What lingers is the human weight of it. The way a political system can become so obsessed with preserving itself that it forgets the fragility of the bodies carrying it forward. And the women carried it forward again and again. They married where they were told. They gave birth under scrutiny. They watched priests, doctors, courtiers, and ambassadors interpret their bodies as national property. They were blamed for miscarriages, blamed for daughters, blamed for weakness, blamed for not saving men who had already built unstable worlds around them. And still, they endured. That may be the clearest thing this history leaves behind. For all the dynastic absurdity, for all the grotesque calculations of blood and title, for all the fragility that built over generations, these women were not merely tragic ornaments drifting through royal halls. They were active presences. Some ruled kingdoms, some guided regencies, some kept courts together. Some negotiated, wrote, planned, funded religious houses, sponsored learning, and shaped the futures of empires, even when official histories preferred to give the credit elsewhere. Their lives were constrained, but they were not empty. And that matters. Because once you stop looking at them as names on a family chart and start looking at them as women living inside time, everything changes. Joanna is no longer just the Mad. Catherine is no longer just Henry's discarded wife. Isabella is no longer merely a womb for empire. Mariana is no longer only the mother of collapse. They become recognizable again, still distant, still royal, but human. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson hiding beneath all the velvet and candlelight. No dynasty, no matter how grand, can preserve itself forever by narrowing the meaning of family into ownership and control. Eventually, the walls close in. Eventually, the blood runs out of room. Eventually, the cost becomes visible. Sometimes in politics, sometimes in war, sometimes in a child who cannot walk, cannot speak clearly, cannot carry what generations demanded he inherit, and sometimes in the silence of a queen sitting alone in a dim chamber after another loss no one will remember properly. By the time Europe began to move beyond the worst of these dynastic patterns, the damage had already been written into portraits, treaties, burial records, and bodies. The crowns survived in altered form.
The states continued. New families rose. Old names faded. But the ghosts of those earlier marriages remained, not just in archives and paintings, but in the warnings they left behind. Power can look eternal when it is wrapped in ceremony, but blood is still blood. Bodies are still bodies, and history, no matter how polished, always keeps the record somewhere. So now, as the palace corridors grow quieter, as the candlelight dims against old stone and the embroidered banners lose their shine in the dark, we can let the story soften. The queens return to their portraits. The letters close. The doctors stop arguing. The family trees at last stop tightening. And somewhere beyond those courts, beyond the genealogies and the wars and the whispered prayers over royal cradles, the world begins to move on. You have followed these women through centuries of dynastic ambition, grief, endurance, and strange inherited fate. You have walked with them through Spain, Austria, Burgundy, Portugal, France, and England. You have seen the hidden cost of crowns, not only in policy, but in bone, blood, and silence. And now it is time to let them rest. Let the names blur gently. Let the palace doors close. Let the silk, the wax, the incense, the prayers, and the long branches of those overburdened family trees fade into the dark. You are far from those courts now, far from those marriages, far from those anxious nurseries and haunted chapels. The crowns are set aside, the candles are burning low, and tonight, at least, no one is asking anything more of you. Rest now, sleep deeply, and be quietly grateful that your family tree is allowed to grow in peace.